Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the move of what if Deku learned about his father's quirk? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku was a lot fitter than the majority of his classmates. At 13, the only one who could hold a torch to him was Shudo, and he really didn't count because some of his workouts were even more intense than what Izuku had to do. In most things the other boy was his equal. In everything else they were pretty nicely halved on who did better. They were still young, so their specialties weren't as honed as they could be, so their inability to define a clear number one was really expected. That didn't make either of them angry per se. While the two of them enjoyed competing, they were also friends and had decided to leave the bloodlust out of their personal competitions. Momo would occasionally join them, and while she wasn't as fit as them, she had monstrous stamina and technical ability. The three friends rejoiced whenever one of them excelled and would push whoever fell behind. But as much as he loved his friends, there was a dark seed in Izuku's heart that he dare not share. While they grew alongside him and saw the three of them standing together, Izuku would look forward with so much uncertainty he'd tremble. He had a fire in his belly and a storm in his heart to become a hero great enough to surpass his father, but sometimes the fire would go down and the storm would quell when he saw how utterly perfectly his friends would match him. Because unlike them, he was quirkless. Unlike them, when they reached high school and entered a hero course, he'd be at the exact same level that they competed every day, but they would receive an immeasurable boost with their quirks. He was so proud of them, he knew they would go so very far and be great. In Izuku's dreams he was standing right next to them in the spotlight. But the reality of his situation had started bearing down on him more heavily when he started PBRY. The kids in his class were changing in accordance with their quirks. One of the girls in his class had a minor strength augmentation quirk, and her shoulders and legs had really grown to sustain her ability. A boy who possessed a stretch quirk was becoming lean and wiry, almost a caricature of lanky limbs. He was in his second year of middle school and had been 13 almost 6 months when his father started him on weight training. The two of them had spent an entire Monday workout session finding out what muscles could handle what weight and for how long. Now that he was firmly in what his dad called the bloom of youth, he could begin building more muscle. So it wasn't like Izuku wasn't growing either, but he could hear them saying, "Oh, look at All Might's kid. He's gotten a lot buffer, right? I told you he was just like his dad," and so on. Shudo had mentioned it in passing as well. He had asked if the level of his augmenting quirk relied on cultivating muscle. Izuku wanted to scream, "I'm quirkless," but couldn't, and just shrugged and said, "My dad just thinks I should build muscle now that I can." The other boy had nodded and moved on, and Izuku wanted to cry because everyone thought he was going to be so great. He wanted to be amazing, but not in the way they were thinking. He tried to keep convincing himself he'd make it to his goal by telling himself his dream was in his grasp, that he was going to make it, that he could stand with the rest of them. Izuku cried one day when he'd found himself looking at Deveron's sister high school's entrance exam requirements for general studies. It was a bad day for him. All Might had found him crying in his room looking at the webpage in tears and called his mother. They both did their best to comfort him. They told him he could be a hero if he wanted. They told him the same things they had been telling him since he was 9, and Izuku had almost screamed through his tears that he didn't want to be just a hero, that he wanted to be the greatest hero of all. It was getting harder and harder for him to convince himself he could make it, and he wondered if he'd have ever had this problem if he was still that friendless little boy that lived with his mom in a middle-class neighborhood and was bullied by his neighbor. On good days he hardly thought about it and was able to just look at his bracelet that he'd had for ages. He'd gotten an extender for it so he could still wear it, and it was enough. The platinum chain with a simple platinum plate that had a ruby and sapphire embedded in it, one on each end, with engraved text that read, "I am here." He'd been mocked for it when he was 8 and had just returned from a summer visit to his father. They had said it was cheap and stupid. But his dad had it made for him custom to remind him that no matter how far apart they were, he'd be with him in his heart. It served to ground him ever since, but now its ability to help was growing weak in the wake of his feelings about the future. Izuku had ended up saving Yue's entrance exam days for general studies bookmarked. Even if he still had more than a year and a half to think about it, he'd still have a chance during the sports festival if he applied to general studies. He didn't think anything could change what he was feeling. Until one day something did. He'd finished his normally scheduled Wednesday legwork and was doing his cool-down stretches when his father spoke up from his place on the stool nearby that he would watch and instruct him from. "Izuku, what do you think being a hero is?" He had to stop a moment and look at his father. The number one hero, All Might, sat in his true form with an expression on his face Izuku barely recognized and suddenly felt he was being tested. Because his father hadn't asked him that question in years, Izuku took a moment to gather his thoughts and calm his sudden nerves before replying. Being a hero means putting yourself on the line for those who need help even if they don't cry out for it. Izuku concentrated on his dad's reaction. When the man closed his eyes and smiled a gentle and happy smile, he felt a wave of warmth and happiness fill him. The man then asked, "What do you intend to do if you get into a hero course? Most of them will be miles ahead of you with their quirks, you know." Izuku nodded. He could feel all his emotions welling up and replied, "I won't know unless I try though. I could be the first quirkless hero. I just want to be the greatest hero, like you. I know it might seem silly, but I just want to help people and make them feel safe with the smile you've given me. And if I can't make it into the hero course, I'll apply to UA's general studies. If I can make a showing at the sports festival, I could still have a chance." Opening his eyes, his dad smiled approvingly before he continued speaking. "I'm so proud of how far you've come, Izuku. You have the potential to be greater than me, I think." Suddenly he was feeling incredibly embarrassed. If that's the case, it's only because you've taken so much time to train and nurture me. I'd never have gotten here if you didn't bring up training and weren't so dedicated." The man shook his head, but his smile remained. "Izuku, you have worked hard to get where you are and never forget that. Just because you know how to do something doesn't mean you'll automatically put your heart into the action. You've gotten where you are from your own efforts, never forget that." Not willing to argue, he just nodded and accepted his father's words. But he was still unsure. He knew what others, like Shudo, were capable of. He wished he could say, "I can stand toe-to-toe with them," and mean it 100%. Technically, Toshinori had been planning this for months, years, if you counted the discussion they had which began Izuku's training. To make sure they met the qualification that Inko had given at the outset, even now he didn't think Izuku was quite ready. But even now Izuku wasn't quite up to snuff, but he'd just started proper weight training. In a couple months, though Izuku would be turning, he was old enough to start a routine to quickly amass the muscle he would need. It was like everything Izuku had been doing was a primer for this moment. Since he was in far better shape than other boys his age, he would begin seeing results quicker, and if he decided to inherit one for all, then there would be a much smaller chance of causing himself injury. Of course, the boy wouldn't be firing off anywhere near even 50% anytime soon, but having a properly trained body was already most of the battle. He had consulted with Gran Torino and Sir Night-Eye months ago. His old mentor fully endorsed the decision and had almost demanded to aid him in Izuku's training should the boy choose to inherit. Toshinori, though it hurt his pride to admit, agreed. Izuku thought much differently than he did, and Gran Torino had far more experience as a teacher. If the retired hero was to help them, then the margin of danger decreased even more. Sir Night-Eye, on the other hand, had taken a week to give his opinion. While he'd approved, it was really Toshinori's choice in the end. It was nice to have those who had helped to train his son support him, though. It was timely as well. Izuku was starting to doubt himself more than ever, and while his son still dreamed of becoming the greatest hero of all time, he was also beginning to doubt that dream due to his current reality. Well, Toshinori would just have to twist his fate a bit. So after they had finished Izuku's workout for the day, he'd asked him what he thought being a hero was and what he planned to do given a chance to enter a hero course. Izuku hadn't disappointing him. After telling him that he had gotten to where he was by his own hard work, he gave a bright smile to the boy who was looking rather abashed and doubtful and declared, "Then I believe you are worthy to inherit my power." He watched the boy's face. It had quickly gone from unsure to completely lost at sea. Then suddenly he was muttering up a storm. Toshinori then did the only thing he could in the face of such a reaction. He laughed. Izuku was feeling like his own father had picked him up and thrown him out the window. His mind was going 1,000,000 kilometers a second, and he was muttering up a storm trying to figure out what his dad was even trying to say. Of course you've never explained your quirk to me, but naturally I assumed it was only inherited through genetics. Maybe it can only be passed when the successor has reached PBR2I. But a quirk like that's never existed, at least to the public's knowledge. Then again, it might not even be grounded in genetics at all, but simply be able to pass itself. What's the limit on that? How is it passed? Is that even possible? Suddenly his dad was laughing, and it broke Izuku's train of thought when the man said, "You're spouting nonsense. It's simple, Izuku. My quirk is the power to transfer power. I was crowned with one for all, a stockpile of energy woven together, crystallized, and bound to a courageous heart who will answer to those in need." Izuku listened carefully, and it was starting to make sense. His father continued, "As for the limits on it, it's passed only when the current holder willingly bestows it." Nodding, the boy thought he understood. "You're offering it to me? But I mean, is it just because I'm your son?" The question seemed almost wrong after asking it, but that didn't change the fact that he needed the answer so much it was going to burn him up. If this were anything else, he'd instantly accept, but he needed to know it was truly because he was deemed worthy and not simply because he was lucky enough to be born All Might's son. His father shook his head. "No. Originally I was planning on finding someone through viewing the UA Sports Festival and putting in an offer for internship to see what kind of person they were. But when you still wanted to be a hero despite being quirkless and continued training just as hard as everyone else with the hope that you could one day stand on the same stage as them. When you repeatedly said your sole longing was to be able to help people the best way there was, well, Sir Knight, I urged me to change my mind." Izuku startled. That was so utterly unexpected. "I fought him, of course. I was worried my affection for you and the fact that you were quirkless, just like me, was clouding my judgment. Eventually, after the accident that led you and your mother to move here, I finally yielded and began to train you. The final decision to make you this offer was made only the day you were told of this special session." He looked down and stared at his hands as he absorbed everything that he was being told. He had earned this. His father and Sir Knight I had recognized him as someone worthy of this great power. Finally he answered, "Yes." There was a moment of silence, then his father laughed again. "I had hoped for nothing less." Izuku asked one more question, "What do I have to do?" The response was instant. "The training you've been receiving up until now has been preparing your body to be a perfect foundation for what's to come. Now that you are 13 and firmly in the bloom of youth, the real show can start." With that, his father practically bounded over to a chair that was along the wall of the dojo and took a few pages of paper that had been placed there and then returned to his side. "You see, right now you have only taken the primer. Next you must kick it into overdrive with this." All Might held up the pages as if they were made of pure gold. "This is my aim to succeed All-American Dream Plan. By following this you will amass a great quantity of muscle rather quickly. Of course nothing comes easy and it will be very difficult. Do you think you can handle it?" The man handed him the papers and Izuku read it over. His entire for the next few months were plotted out in a training schedule that looked like some sort of nightmarish caricature of what he had formerly expected this year's summer crunch was going to be. The reality of what he was being told was setting in, and all the dark doubt that had settled in his heart over the past few months was becoming hazy, and the dream-like goal that this all-American dream plan was designed to help him reach was solidifying in his mystified mind. Suddenly, he could feel a sea of lava-like warmth and hope bubbling up inside him and overflowing. The tears that he'd been holding back were finally pouring out, and he was sobbing uncontrollably. I can stand with them," he shouted through tears. A large hiccup burst forth. "I've always had to work harder than them. But now if I just push a little further, I have a chance." His father drew closer and placed an arm around Izuku's shoulder as he trembled and cried, "I'll do my best with everything I've been blessed with." Shudo had always known his life was a mess, but really having two friends to compare it to was helping him put things into perspective. For a while he took comfort in thinking the only abnormal part of his life was his but whole of an old man. But now, Momo, who mind you had once gotten in trouble for making explosives, was now working on constructing the components of a firearm. Her parents and All Might had made some phone calls and she was spending her Wednesdays at the police academy to do so in a controlled environment. Izuku was starting a training regimen that had crawled its way out from hell and murdered the training units Shudo had been given during his summer crunch, and then proceeded to dance on the grave of said units. Shudo was starting to think that maybe all of their lives were a bit screwed up and his wasn't as normal as he had thought. There were 2 kids in his class that were also aiming to be heroes. That was strange to him because it had taken a year and a half and them declaring their goals when they were discussing their futures in class for him to even find that out. He and Izuku had paid them a bit of attention after that to see if they were worth befriending. Since the schedule of one in training to be a hero was rigorous and time-consuming, they were always on the lookout for potential friends. But quickly it became apparent to them that all the preparation they did was talk about it. After school they would go out with their own group and go to the arcade and eat out. They led the same lives as everyone else in the class. That led Shudo wonder if maybe their trust trio was working a lot harder than everyone else that had dreams for a hero course. One hangout Sunday, while they were at a cafe, he even asked, "Do you think anyone else does as much work we do to get into UA? We still have more than a year and a half, but we kind of talk about it like it's soon." Izuku and Momo both sputtered on their drinks and Momo declared, "A year and a half is soon. Look at Izuken. Look at him. He's gained like 50 pounds in the last couple months with his workout from hell. Give him another couple and he'll really be small might. A year and a half is no time at all." Izuku was nodding emphatically. "She's right, you know. It'll be here before you know it, and anyone who doesn't work as hard as us is going to have a really bad time." Momo then, while cleaning the mess her drink had made, said, "The UA admittance is no joke. Even for people getting in on recommendations, the screening for that is supposed to be really tough too." Thinking on it, he agreed, "That's true. I've just been thinking about how different we live compared to everyone else in our age group, even those that claim to be walking the path to become a hero." Suddenly Izuku was nodding sagely. "Trust me, Shochan. Most kids want to be heroes and think wanting is good enough. Back before I moved to be with my dad, every kid in my primary was saying they'd be heroes. Even the older kids in the neighborhood who were already in middle school would say that." That was also surprising to him. Izuku hardly ever mentioned the time he had lived away from his father, but the other boy continued, "I learned a long time ago that if you're aiming for the top you have to work harder than everyone else. Those kids will all go into hero courses and maybe even do well, but we're shooting for UA and already know the stakes for a school like that. So everyone else is just being lax?" Shudo asked and Izuku just laughed and smiled again. Momo was smiling too. "Not lax. Just complacent? They haven't really considered that a million other kids want their dream as well and only one person can have it." Izuku clarified. He was still smiling, but there was an edge there that Shudo understood well. "That makes sense," was the response he gave and sipped high tea. "I suppose we've been put in a special category simply by being born to the right parents. Because of our biardage we've been guided to succeed." Momo was nodding in agreement and he had expected the same from Izuku, but the boy's face was now serious. "Shudo, my dad made it to the top from nothing. He recently told me, you've gotten where you are from your own efforts, never forget that, and it's been hard but I'm starting to accept that I've gotten as strong as I am from my own drive to succeed. So have you, Shochan. No one else can claim your power." There was a warmth of affection for his friends spreading through him as Momo replied, "I'd never thought of it that way. But it's true, no one else did my work for me." Shudo just quietly whispered a simple, "Thank you," but Izuku smiled and his friends both understood all the feeling he put behind it. There was a point that Izuku realized that his life was pretty wild. He's not really sure when it happened, but the knowledge exists now and there is no running from it. Really, when he was 8 and asking for as much All Might merchandise he could because he had the biggest secret ever, he should have been clued in. But still he was 8 and really didn't grasp how crazy and unlikely the whole situation was. He was a bit more clueless about it when he was Izuku's parent had always made sure he didn't tell anyone who his dad was, and at the time it felt like a game. He could vividly remember waiting for his Quirk to show up and trying to pick up whatever he could or pull things to him like his mother. He could remember all the things he'd done but not what he was feeling. But now, working towards the goal that was shining in front of him like a beacon in a storm. He'd never forget the feelings from this time in his life. Izuku was pushing himself closer and closer to his starting line, and it was almost as if he could see his friends in the distance waiting for him. He'd never forget having to work so hard just to be able to stand on the same stage that everyone else had been born on. Every day he was working towards something he used to think was a fantasy. It seemed impossible that every ounce of muscle he gained, he was one step closer to his dream. While it was difficult, it was still doable, so he was still having a bit of a hard time reconciling his mind to the new reality he was faced with. Inheriting his father's quirk was a dream he had lost in a sterile hospital room when he was, but now that dream was renewed. But things were about to get harder. Izuku wasn't on his regimen from hell, as his friends lovingly called it, very long before his father was telling him it was about to get worse. Of course he didn't use those words exactly. One very early Sunday his dad just said, "We're about to go even further. I found a perfect place for this." Then proceeded to drag him out of bed, make him change into workout clothes, then dragged him out of the house and actually hopped into their seldom used truck. The entire ride his dad refused to tell him where they were heading, and once they got there Izuku still couldn't figure it out. His father presented him with what looked like a trash heap and declared, "You're going to clean this entire beach park." Suddenly he was hit with a wave of skepticism. "Alone? That will take ages. This is practically a landfill." The man laughed and placed a hand on his shoulder before saying, "Today heroes are all about flash and glamour. Heroes were originally civil servants and those who did good. None of them expected recognition. So before you inherit you will perform a truly heroic task." Izuku started at the trash heap anew. He began to see how appealing the area could be if it was cleared. Suddenly he was hit with a bit of sadness at the sight of what was surely a once appealing place. "Why is it like this?" All Might sighed. "It seems that this place is a victim of illegal dumping. There are many places like this, sadly." The boy nodded and said, "With my schedule, when am I even going to have time for this?" His dad's reply was quick and sure, "Don't worry quite yet. I've worked on an altered American dream plan and have worked this in. You will be starting this next Monday, and since your school is a bit away you'll only have a few hours at most per day. If you pace yourself you'll be fine, follow the plan, and rest when you need to, you'll be fine. It should take you about 6 to 7 months at most. You'll be well into your final term when you finish. Remember, you must get no recognition for this, no telling even your friends." Inhaling then letting it out, Izuku nodded. That gave him a good amount of time to do this. It was a lot, but he had faith in his father's scheduling. "So I'll come here after school then and probably even do a workout here. Looking at the size of some of this stuff, moving it will be a workout in itself. So that's why we brought the truck." All Might was suddenly surprised by the question, and it caused Izuku to smile. His rambles never ended that way, and it was funny that he could catch his father in a moment when he wasn't really paying attention. "Yes, I'll be bringing the truck on days I can meet you here, but I'm busy, so some days you'll just have to place the trash at the entrance and I'll load it up when I have the time." The man smiled, then ruffled the boy's hair. "Now let's get started, shall we?" His father then grabbed some ropes that had been in the back of the truck and made his way to the trash heap. Izuku followed, not quite sure what was happening. The man seemed to be looking for something. Suddenly he smiled and bounded towards a fridge that was lying on its side. Izuku watched as he powered up, wrapped it in ropes, tied a few knots, and perched himself on top of the fridge. Izuku stared at the spectacle for a moment before his dad urged him, "Pick up the ropes and see how far you can pull me. I made them like straps to make it easier." Izuku just gave a dry, incredulous laugh, half humored and half panicked because he actually expected him to do it. "I can haul you or the fridge separately, Dad. Together I'm not so sure." His response was an encouraging, "Have confidence and just try it. Even if you can pull me just a bit." The boy frowned and eyed the scene and lifted one of the makeshift rope straps. "Dad, you weight what? 255 kilograms? The fridge is 114? That's like almost 400 kilograms. There's no way I'm pulling that." Suddenly his father got very serious and said in his normal voice, "Izuku, put the straps on and pull." A chill ran up Izuku's spine at the tone of the request. He hadn't heard that voice come out of that version of his father's face in years, and it made him feel like there was spiders crawling up his back. The dad voice was truly a terrifying thing, so unable to argue, Izuku put the straps on and sighed in defeat. Then with all his might he pumped his legs and leaned forward with a mighty pull. Surprisingly, it budged. Not anything impressive, but he could feel a slight give before it stopped and shoved itself in the sand. Izuku sighed and stopped pulling, then turned to his dad. "So?" All Might had his face in his hands and said, "You're so adorable. You pulled it a whole 31 centimeters. Izuku blushed at his father's antics. "Please. Can we begin properly now?" The man just nodded and hopped of the fridge, and the boy began his work. From that day, Izuku's life started to look a bit like this. He went for a run in the morning, showered, ate breakfast, then headed off to school. After school, he would jump on a bus to the beach park, do a warm-up and move as much trash as he could, with workouts in between, before getting home at around 6:30, eating and doing homework. He then slept and then did it all again. The only exception to this schedule is Friday through Sunday. The Sunday and Saturday he rests, and Friday is the day he spends with Shudo. Really, it's a bit of an impossible mess. He's spending at most 2 hours a day moving trash. So about a month in, he decides Wednesday is becoming a rest day for him, and he's going to start moving trash early morning on Sundays. While he's tired during the afternoon on Sunday when he hangs out with his friends, but as long as he went to bed early he'd be fine. And the fact that he could see more progress happening at the beach and with his body once he made that change doesn't really hurt either. Todoroki Shudo wasn't really someone who pushed his nose into other people's business. But Izuku's schedule was becoming erratic, and it was starting to worry him. When he and Momo would text him after school, and after his normal workout routine time, Izuku wasn't answering them. Momo had finally broken down and asked about it during a video conference study session, and Izuku had informed them he wasn't training at home every day anymore and left it at that. That, of course, was a non-answer and made Shudo even more curious. Of course, he had no right to be. He kept his own secrets about things. Hell, Izuku was rather courteous to inform them about his training schedules, considering Momo only shared when hers changed, and Shudo never shared any details ever because he knew his father's schedules were ridiculously rigorous and his friends would worry. But Izuku was one to overshare when it came to these things, and the fact that he wasn't sharing at all was bothering him. The only reason he hadn't said anything was the fact that Izuku was still holding up as well as before when he just had the regimen from hell. Besides, he had all the confidence in the world that All Might was taking care of his friend. His own status with his father was the same as ever. Shudo barely spoke to him anymore. Apparently Enji wouldn't talk to him unless it was to argue. So Shudo avoided Endeavor altogether, and it seemed to be working for the most part. Fuyumi had apologized for telling their father about his friends, and Shudo had just forgiven her. It didn't mean he'd be trusting her with anything important, but she seemed relieved and still made him breakfast on the occasional morning when she was up for it. She was still trying to get him to open up, but he didn't think that would ever happen. Still, she held out, and he had to give her some credit. He only ever saw his brothers when they were out in the garden, and he was shutting his window because their noise was disturbing him. During the week, he mostly looked forward to after school when he and his friends would text each other, or their video study sessions on Wednesdays. Those things made him feel less alone and filled up a void that had been growing in his heart for some time. Of course, his favorite thing of all was Sundays, when he could walk with Momo in the mall and Izuku would burst forward at something he'd seen and wanted to share. He could feel like he was just Shudo and everything else fell away. Still, he enjoyed all the times he spent with his friends, like today. It was a Friday, and they would be riding the bus together to Sir Nitai's agency to borrow his obstacle course and practice their hand-to-hand combat. So, when the school day was over, they made their trek across the school grounds to where the buses waited them. He was glad that no one ever really stopped them. Their first few months were awkward in that everyone had fawned over them for a bit. But after that, they'd relegated to whispering about them and treating them like they didn't actually exist. Shudo wondered how he would have made it through middle school without losing another part of himself if it wasn't for Momo and Izuku. The two of them rode their bus and contentedly chatted about homework and their plans for the day. It was a routine that Shudo was used to, and they would even text Momo things on occasion during their ride. When they reached Nightai's agency, they both waltzed in. They were regulars and weren't given any hassle, except for the customary security check. They were left alone. After changing, they began their warm-up routines. What surprised him, though, was Sir Nightai entering their small corner and smiling at them before approaching. The hero never watched them, he only ever approached them to tell them they couldn't work out in the obstacle course for whatever reason, so that's what Shudo was expecting. But no, Nightai came to them smiling but sighed. Both boys stopped their workout to give him their attention when he finally spoke. Todoroki, Izuku, I don't want to interrupt you for too long, so I'll cut to the chase. I've decided to take on a UA intern this year, and I don't think I'll be able to care for you two sufficiently and train him at the same time. As the words registered, Shudo's heart was speeding up, and he felt like the world was crashing around him. Still, Nightai continued, I know this is sudden. I wasn't planning on this, but I saw him during the sports festival and I had snatched him up. Shudo looked to Izuku, who was looking surprised but was nodding slowly. He then smiled. Sure thing. Can't wait to meet him, uncle. Nightai just smiled. He reminds me of you a bit. If I'm wrong about him, I'll allow you two to continue to come. The other boy shook his head. Your feelings tend to be good, so I doubt you'll take us back. And with every word they were saying, Shudo was flying farther from reality. Luckily, Izuku noticed and reached out to him, touching his shoulder gently. The touch grounded him and Shudo finally breathed. He hadn't even noticed he wasn't, and said, I hope your internship works out. Nightai nodded and said, I've made the obstacle course extra difficult as a bit of a last hurrah for the two of you. Both boys nodded and thanked him, and after a bit more small talk he was leaving, and Shudo felt like he'd taken a part of him. Izuku turned to him and smiled. Well, I guess this means whoever wins today takes it all for now, right? Shudo shook his head. I don't like this. His friend's expression softened. Oh, Shochan. We can always spar together somewhere else. But he shook his head. Your training schedule has gotten more intense and you could use the extra day for whatever you've been doing after school. Once Endeavor hears I'm not coming here on Fridays anymore, he'll fill up my unit and I'll go back to how it was. Suddenly he was pressing his hand to his own cheek. It felt like everything was crashing down. Izuku was getting too busy for him, and no doubt Momo, who had always been closer to Izuku, would soon follow. He felt like he was curling in on himself when suddenly his shoulders were grabbed firmly and he was jolted from his thoughts by Izuku's voice. Hey, it will be fine. We see each other every day and we still have Sundays to hang out, Shochan. It will be fine. We'll be okay. Breath, Shochan. He inhaled sharply at the prompt, then exhaled. Izuku's hands never left his shoulders. I didn't realize how much my schedule was affecting you. I'm so sorry. Izuku whispered, and Shudo shook his head, but the boy went one. I know you don't talk to anyone but me and Momo. Momo doesn't know that it's my fault, Shochan. I haven't been paying enough attention to you, so I'm sorry. Finally he found his voice. It's not your fault, Izuku. It's not your job to take care of me. I'm fine now. I just have to get used to this. Izuku shook his head, then seemed to grow determined and said, We're getting into UA together. It's only for a little while that it will be like this. Shudo nodded, finally finding his calm again. Momo will be there too. With our last names we'll all probably be clumped in the back. Izuku laughed. We'll be the weird, heroes, kids in the back, that make jokes about accidentally blowing up a garden wall. A laugh bubbled up from his chest at the image it put in his head, and Izuku once again said, We'll be okay until then. And Shudo had to agree. When Momo boarded her bus home on Friday, she found a couple of messages on her phone. Izuku, apparently Uncle Nightai is taking on an intern and can't have me and Shudo anymore. New schedule means the end of Spar Friday. Shochan, I'll be fine. No. Sigma, maybe me and Shochan can do something together while Izuku is busy. Shochan, that sounds fun. Maybe we can have an extra study session. Emo-chan, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do it next week. We can talk about it more on Sunday. Shochan, sounds good. Izuku, yay. That sounds fun, you guys. Emo-chan, you'll be fine, Izuku. You'll be fine. Shaking her head, Momo frowned. She felt a bit bad that the two of them no longer had a place nor the time to spar, but she was happy she could help Shudo out. Really, she was a bit jealous of how close Izuku and Shudo had become, but really they couldn't help it. Momo sat back in her seat on the bus and listened to her music while watching the cars go by. When she arrived home, her parents were still at work, so she checked the kitchen counter for any notes they may have left her. Normally, if her parents were going to be out late, they would provide money for takeout or even have food ready for Momo to prepare. This time, however, there was no note, so Momo assumed that at least one of her parents would be home soon. Heading to her room, she changed into her workout clothes and did her routine before showering. By the time she was done changing, Momo could hear someone in the living room, so she headed to greet whoever was home. When she got to the kitchen, she found her mother preparing some meat and smiled in greeting. "Do you need any help, Mom? I just have homework left." The woman smiled. "Thank you, dear. There's a basket of vegetables in the fridge. Could you get it out? I'm going to make a sukiyaki." Momo nodded and began shuffling through the fridge for the basket, and when she found it, began washing and chopping them for the meal. Doing this was something normal for her and really helped her relax and wind down from an otherwise long week. While she still had one more day of school, it was still the end of the week and it was her rest day. So to her, it didn't really count. It was nice to take it slow and spend some time with her mother at the end of the day, and filled her with a sense of contentment. Momo began humming a song she didn't know the words to and soaked up the atmosphere. While slicing the beef, her mother asked, "Any plans for the weekend?" Mom thought for a moment as she chopped some mushrooms, then replied, "I want to go look for some dresses after school tomorrow." The woman frowned. "You know I don't like you going shopping alone." Momo held back a sigh and replied, "I'm going to see if Izuku for Shochan want to come with me." Her mother stopped her slicing and turned to her, and Momo felt tired suddenly. She loved her Momo and they got along, but it felt whenever her friend were brought up it became a tug-o-war, and she really shouldn't have said anything at all. "I don't see why you can't go with a girl from your class. What about that Ando girl? You've known her since primary." Continuing to chop her vegetables, Momo kept herself collected. "Ando and I don't get along, and I would rather go with someone who knows my tastes. Besides, I don't think anyone would want to go with me if I asked tomorrow suddenly." It was a bit of a twisted truth. Shaking her head, the woman sighed. "Okay, well, what about Sunday? Any plans then?" Momo was beginning to feel like they were going to argue about her friends again. "Sunday we're just going to hang out like usual." She nodded and gave a bit of a forced smile. "I was hoping you'd have made more friends by now, Momo." Momo sighed and tried to change the subject. "How was work?" "It was fine. We had a pretty quiet day overall." Her mother sighed and shook her head before replying, "Your father should actually be home soon too. He doesn't have too many cases to wrap up." She just smiled and said, "I'm glad. You two have been pretty busy recently." Then just kept chopping vegetables. The woman went back to slicing her meat. "We're fine, you don't have to worry about us." When her mother finished, Momo quietly put her vegetables into the sukiyaki pot. Finally, when the sukiyaki was cooking, Momo brought her homework out and began working on it at the kitchen table. Her mother took out her laptop, seemed busy with whatever task she had set herself to when asked about what Momo was working on, and helped with a few problems. Momo did her best not to heave a sigh of relief. She couldn't even begin to describe how grateful she was that her mother hadn't begun lecturing her on her choice of friends again. It was a subject the two of them did their best to avoid. Sometimes Momo wondered what her mother really thought about the Yagis. The woman talked about Inko like she was God's gift and held as much respect as any hero did for All Might. Sometimes she'd even express concern that Izuku had too much on his shoulders. But for some reason it was difficult for the woman to understand that Izuku and Shudo were her best friends, and they talked about everything and nothing with her. They even asked her about how she made things when it was something as mundane as a toothpick, and they did it with enthusiasm. The two actually cared. Izuku shared his notebooks and Shudo was always there to talk. Momo wanted to say that they were the only people she could even fathom opening up to right now, that how was she going to say that her best friends were Izuku and Shudo, and please don't you dare even ask them about their dads? To anyone. How would she even begin to let anyone into their precious bubble of stupid emojis and jokes about Izuku's ridiculous workouts and Shudo's fascination with the fact she almost blew something up when she was 7? And it wasn't because she didn't like the idea of new friends. It was because no one seemed quite good enough to share all that with. And she'd given her reasons 1,000 times, but her mom was no longer accepting them. Suddenly the woman asked, "So what are you building now?" Momo felt a bit wary at the sudden turn of their conversation and said, "I'm still working on gunpowder and basic firearms." Her mother nodded and turned back to screen. "That's good. I'm glad. How are you doing? Anything you're having trouble with?" The girl nodded and said, "The gunpowder is still kind of difficult and takes me a while to make, but I've pretty much mastered the metals I need." She was met with an approving nod. "I'm so proud of you. You know that, right? No matter what you may think, your father and I think you're amazing." She felt a lot of warmth from the comment. Momo knew they were proud, but it was nice to hear. "Thank you, it means a lot to hear that, Mom." Her mother really did her best, she supposed. They just had a hard time understanding each other. She just wished that she'd apologized once in a while for acting like her friends weren't good enough for her. When her father got home, they ate dinner and she went upstairs to her room and opened up this trust trio. "Emo-chan, Mom still wishes you were girls. Also told me to hang out with Ando. Izuku, you, sorry that's messed up. Sho-chan, why does she want us to be girls? Emo-chan, she thinks if I have a magical friendship with a girl I'd discover the meaning to life and realize that I'm just pretending to like the things you like to look cool. Also she thinks I like one of you guys and want to date you. Shogun, that's... Izuku, it's okay Sho-chan. It's okay. Duh. Emo-chan, it kinda ruined my night but I will prevail. Izuku. Sho-chan. Emo-chan, I'm just glad she hasn't told me not to hang out with you guys. Izuku, I don't understand her. Her and Mom get along. Don't ask me. I don't get it either. Sho-chan, it sounds frustrating. Emo-chan, it really is. Sho-chan, what does your dad think? Emo-chan, we don't really talk anymore. He kind of thinks since we're both girls my mom knows what I need. It's frustrating because she's complaining about you guys but she has no idea what you even mean to me. Izuku, oh Momo. You mean a lot to us too. You were my first real friend and I'd be a totally different person without you. Sho-chan, that's really rough. I don't really know what to say. Haven't you and Izuku been friends since you were 9? Did it bother her then? Emo-chan, yeah we have. Izuku, no Sho-chan. But a lot was going on then and now she probably wishes she'd done something. Emo-chan? What are you talking about? Izuku, don't worry about it Emo-chan. It's just, I can't talk about it. Emo-chan, that's fine I guess. But if something was going on back then, I can't see why she would have just ignored the fact my friend was a boy. Izuku. Izuku. A lot was happening and I was just moved from my old school where I was bullied and put into a really hectic situation. And since I know what was happening, trust me I wouldn't be surprised if it was enough for her to overlook the fact that I was a boy. Sho-chan, I am very intrigued about this a lot, but I'll ignore it since you asked. Same. Izuku, I feel like it's my fault that you're arguing with your mom. Sho-chan, no. Momo kept you around so it's still her choice. Izuku, kept me around. Emo-chan, haha. But Sho-chan is right. It's 100% my mom. Izuku, okay. I just feel a bit guilty is all. Emo-chan, well don't. Sho-chan, so what brought on the conversation anyways? Emo-chan, right. Thanks for bringing us back on track. I'm going shopping after school Saturday. Do you guys want to come? Izuku, can't sleeping forever that day. Sho-chan, yeah I can go. Izuku, get your rest. Emo-chan, okay I'll meet you at the mall by that dress shop by the taiyaki stand we always go to. Sho-chan. She laid back on her bed and sighed. Izuku had just given her a paradigm shift she never thought she'd have. But looking back to that time, it made sense that something was happening in his life and he'd never told her. How often did he face enormous life changes and kept quiet? How many times was he sworn to secrecy regarding his own life and experiences because his father was all might? Momo felt so stupid that she hadn't noticed something that had affected her peripherally. Even then it was just a possible reason for her mother's behavior. She'd never really know unless she asked, but if she asked, it would imply she knew what was happening, and suddenly Momo felt so tired so she decided to think on it later and got to bed, really after the day she needed it. Most of Toshinori's time these days, when it wasn't spent performing heroics, was dedicated to the care and teaching of Izuku. Many of his methods were borrowed from his own mentors and many were taken from various books and articles that he had managed to get his hands on. Toshinori had searched for ages to find a place that Izuku could perform a heroic act for society without recognition. The beach park he had chosen was perfect for every one of their needs. Izuku had been cleaning the beach for a couple months now and was doing very well. It made him proud to see his son's effort bear fruit. Overall, with the help of Sir Night-Eye and Gran Torino, his son was making excellent progress in his effort to become a suitable vessel for One for All. Time was drawing close, and Izuku would probably be ready sometime in the summer. It wasn't the spring that Toshinori had previously hoped for, but it was close enough. It was good timing as well. Many of his juniors and contemporaries that knew about his condition were expecting him to retire. Some of them even looked to his son. The advent of Izuku was going to be right on time. Really, All Might, despite a brief lull in activity a few years back, was still incredibly active on the public scene. Toshinori did his best every day to spread out his 4-hour limit as much as he could to do the best that he could. A lot of heroes that he trusted knew about his condition and were an incredible help to him that he didn't think he would ever be able to repay. But he knew his limit was getting shorter and shorter, and with Izuku going at the rate he was, the boy would be inheriting One for All soon. There were some people in the group of those who knew of his quirk that didn't know that. Principal Nedzufuron had no clue and had started sending him recommendations for different members of UA's student body that he felt showed promise. In the end, it was Principal Nedzu that was the source of his biggest problem and his greatest solution. He'd gotten the letter only that morning, and now he was sitting in the dojo, really staring at it and looking into the future, thinking about everything Sir Night-Eye and he had been so near a falling out over, the thing that had caused their friendship to reach a point where it would probably never be the same. Everything Inko had worried about for the past few years and everything Izuku represented to him. He thought about Nana and sighed. Folding the letter, Toshinori went to find Inko to tell her what had come up. He found his wife reading a novel on the porch. She greeted him with a smile and he kissed her on the cheek before sitting next to her and cutting right to the chase. Principal Nedzu offered me a teaching job at UA. Inko gasped and suddenly she practically threw down her book and looked like she was going to cry. Toshi, what are you saying? Inhaling, he continued, he's worried about my health and has offered it in order to help me slow down a bit. Nedzu also thinks it will give me more time with my successor. He doesn't know about Izuku, but he does know I've been thinking about one. He looked to his wife and his heart broke at the joy and relief he saw in her eyes, but there was also a problem, and Inko got to the heart of it when she asked, what would the commute be like for that though? Taking the job would require me to live within the UA's district. Otherwise the long hours combined with the commute would be too much. Toshinori sighed and looked to his wife. If I took this job, the entire family would have to move back to the same prefecture that the two of you used to live. Inko pressed her lips together. She was obviously more conflicted now. How long do you have to consider it? I mean, if Izuku agrees to this, how long do you have? Toshinori scratched his nose and looked up to the afternoon sky. Nedza gave me till the end of the school year. You see, if I accept it now, next year will be spent taking the classes required for a teaching license at UA, but we'd have to move before then for me to be able to register for that prefecture. Inko nodded and sighed. We'll have to talk to Izuku about it and consider what it means for him and his education. But Toshi, I really think you should take it. I've been wanting you to slow down for years, and I don't know if I can handle the uncertainty anymore. Despite his injury, he was one of the busiest heroes around. Of course, his wife had been worried for him. Her concern was a key factor in this decision, and it was weighing on him heavily. If he took this job, there would be a chance he was going to be teaching Izuku, so he'd have to talk to Nedzu about that as well and make arrangements. It was really starting to eat at him. Toshinori adored the idea that he would be giving his wife some security and that he would have a chance to guide his son while he attended UA, but the fact of the matter was he didn't know if Izuku would be willing to part with his friends for his last year of middle school. On top of that, he didn't want the boy to part with them just because his parents had made an arbitrary decision or because he thought they wanted it. They'd have to have a long discussion on the matter. Inko smiled and took his hand. We both want what's best for this family, so as long as we keep that in mind, it will work out, Toshi. He nodded and gave her a smile. I hope so. Shudo wasn't really accustomed to going places with just Momo. The Saturday they had spent looking for a dress for her was an exception rather than the rule. But now, with Izuku's new schedule that seemed there to stay, the two of them spent a bit more time together on Saturdays. That's not to say the three of them had spent every Saturday together before, but on the rare occasion they did go anywhere after school, they all tended to go together. Now though Izuku was sleeping a lot more and while he missed his friend, the boy needed it. The biggest change that occurred though was the fact that he and Momo studied together over video chat on Fridays to replace Friday spars. Izuku joined them on occasion, but his Fridays now mostly belonged to Momo. That was something that was far more regular. And Shudo was rather unsurprised to find it nice. There were some things the two of them couldn't talk about when Izuku was around. That's not to say they didn't want to talk about them. But discussing your quirk with someone who never even disclosed their quirk's classification was a bit awkward. So Shudo tended to talk about quirk strain and technique with Momo. The two of them also discussed the newest All Might merchandise that was coming out. Really it was mostly actual studying, but if the two of them felt the need to talk about their own quirk setbacks and growth, they went to one another. It was during one of those discussions he brought up the subject that they had been dancing around. Shudo had talked about his own frosting and how he was trying to design a hero costume that had an apparatus where he wouldn't need to adjust his temperature with his left side, and suddenly the thought struck him. Has Izuku ever told you anything about his quirk? Anything that could hint to what it could be? Momo paused in surprise, then seemed to consider it. Of course she would be the one to ask about Izuku's quirk. She had known him for much longer than Shudo had, and while a lot of people speculated what Izuku's quirk could be, the two of them would be in a better position to puzzle it out. Occam's razor dictated that Izuku had his father's quirk and was only secretive because All Might was also silent on the topic. While Shudo believed that too, there was still a part of him dying for confirmation. Momo finally replied by shaking her head. Anything he might have said would have been back when we first met. I've probably forgotten it by now. Shudo frowned and she laughed a bit. You really should let it go or just ask him. Why does this mean so much to you? Really, it was hard to put into words. Momo had inherited a nice combination of her parents' quirks, and it really carried no baggage with it. If Izuku inherited his father's power, then maybe Shudo could ask him how he did it. Then maybe he'd understand. I think that I'd understand myself better through Izuku if I knew. He's so passionate about my left side. I feel like knowing what his quirk is would change the meaning of his words somehow. Momo frowned. Shochan, the only way you're going to get that answer is asking him yourself, and I can't even begin to tell you what he'll say. Maybe you shouldn't try to understand yourself through him? I don't think it's a good idea. Shaking his head, there was suddenly a burning sensation in his throat. I'm not trying to compare our fathers or even our situations. I can't explain it, but I'm missing something, and maybe if I knew. He suddenly stopped because he really didn't know what he was looking for. After all, it's why he needed to know in the first place. Momo smiled and said, Shochan, just remember not to compare yourself to him too much. It's not good to compare yourself to anyone too often. Of course she was right. Whether measuring yourself against someone weaker or stronger, he knew better than anyone else that kind of behavior could lead to unsavory feelings. I know. For Izuku, the cleaning of the beach park was going faster than he thought it would. Really, he was constantly exhausted, and every Saturday he was practically dead to the world, but he was almost halfway done and right on schedule. He was practically buzzing in his excitement. He could practically see his goal being accomplished, and he did his best to remind himself that halfway wasn't actually done. Otherwise, he may have climbed onto the nearest building and screamed at the top of his lungs for no other reason than simply feeling alive. Time spent with his friends was the core reason for the time slipping by so quickly. Looking forward to the days he'd spend with them, whether it be on Sunday when they all relaxed and just hung out, or it was a Wednesday video study session. Measuring his weeks in sections really made them pass swiftly. Izuku was doing the last of his homework on the kitchen table while his mother was across from him on her computer browsing through her favorite recipe exchange website, and his father sat between them at what was technically the head of their square table doing paperwork for his agency. In other words, it was a frighteningly normal evening for them. They had all eaten dinner and they were winding down and just enjoying each other's company. Soon his parents would retire to their room and talk or watch a movie. Izuku would then go to his room and look for any news stories he hadn't caught during the day. He found comfort in the routine, but suddenly the evening wasn't so average when his dad cleared his throat and announced, "I've been offered a job teaching at UA and I'm considering accepting. After all, it's about time I've wound down, and if you make it into the hero course here I'll be more capable of guiding you. It will be a secret for now, just until the school announces it." The sudden pronouncement sent a wave of apprehension through Izuku's body. There were several things in that statement that bothered him. "You're not just thinking about it because of me, right? I don't want you slowing down just because you really don't have to." "Izuku." The man sighed and his mom smiled softly at him before he continued, "I really do. If I'm going to give you my quirk, I'm eventually going to be quirkless, just as I was before I inherited it." Izuku stared at his father. There was a bit of a hollowed-out pit in his stomach forming and his heart was speeding up, causing his breathing to increase. "Quirkless?" His sudden outburst seemed to cause the hero some alarm as he immediately responded with a sputtering cough that wound down to a laugh. "I told you so already, didn't I? I was just as quirkless as you are when I was your age." The woman across from him seemed to be smiling, a bit amused at their antics. She decided to explain a bit. "It's why neither of us were really surprised at the diagnosis. It was wrong for us not to tell you. It probably made you feel worse thinking you were somehow an anomaly in the family." As she spoke, her smile had faded and begun being replaced by a trembling lip and softly forming tears. Izuku, feeling guilty, was quick to reply, "No. It was fine." "And no, it wasn't," he father replied. "I should have told you a lot of things sooner, but we're here now. And I'm trying to make up for that by telling you this." Guilt suitably quelled, Izuku remembered the confusion and pain he felt as a 4-year-old and relented. "I'm sorry, go ahead. What are you trying to tell me?" All Might sighed and rubbed one of his eyes tiredly. "There's no easy way to say this. Your mother has wanted me to slow down for a very long time. Hell, Night Eye and Gran Torino thought I should have retired when you were 9. So I'm long overdue for a change of pace, Izuku. Teaching at UA is the ideal solution to the problem. At least it would be if we didn't have to move back to the place you and your mother left. After all, if we move to that province you will most likely have to change schools." There was a sudden stutter in his heart. The information he was getting was going to overload his brain and his hands were feeling clammy like he had some sort of cold fever. "Move." It was a whisper that escaped his lips. "But this wouldn't be until you started teaching, right?" His mother frowned and shook her head. "Izuku, please, you have to understand. Your father is very ill. At the rate he's going in 2 years, he may not even be able to use his quirk." All Might also frowned. "I still need a teaching license and that requires classes. If we wanted to delay the move last minute you would have to transfer schools sometime during the start of your 3rd year. Your mother and I think it would be better for you if we moved after this school year ended and before the next one began." Clenching his fists, hoping that the pressure would calm him, Izuku tried to breathe. "Can't I just commute to Deveron? It would be killer, but I could still do it, right?" All Might shook his head. "Son, your entire 3rd year must be spent cultivating your quirk before high school. You'll need all the time you can get and an extra long commute won't do you any favors. There is a difference between pushing yourself because you must and pushing yourself because you didn't want to change." Izuku looked to his mother, and she gave him a soft and sorry smile. Of course he understood where they were coming from. He knew how bad his father was. He did his best to ignore it all the time and pretend it was okay, but really he had been hyper-aware of the man's condition since he was 9 and crying for his papa to be all right. Since really, the decision to teach, All Might was the #1 hero for a reason, and with his time running short it was vital that he pass on his know-how to the next generation of heroes. Izuku supported it in that sense, but his mind kept running into the wall of, "I can't abandon Momo and Shudo like this." Because first he chose Deveron over Momo, then with Shudo their spars were taken away, and now this. And he couldn't even tell his friend why. Just that he might have to move to another school. He swallowed and nodded slowly. It was colored with a bit of resignation. The words he wanted were evading him, but he did his best. "When will I be able to tell Momo and Shudo we might be moving?" The response was a heavy sigh of relief from his mother and from his father, a concise reply. I'm going to call Principal Nedzu on Friday. You can tell your friends about the move once the job goes through, of course. As I said before, you can't tell them about the job itself though. With a sharp nod the boy said, I'm sure they'll understand. It was then that in his heart Izuku determined to finish the beach as soon as he could and celebrate with his friends by treating them somehow. Really, it was the least he could do with all the secrets he kept, and it wasn't like he could tell them about the process he was going through to earn a quirk, nor could he excitedly tell them about it when the plan was to act like he'd gotten it from his father the normal way. No, but he could take them out for dinner or a festival and they could celebrate it with him that way, and he could apologize for all the worry and stress he constantly gave them. Izuku had more scheduled naps than when he was a toddler, and his father just kept reminding him that it was to let his body recover and grow. The closer he came to completing his goal of cleaning the beach park, the more real the idea of inheriting his father's quirk became. The more he worked and the more he learned, the more the whole "don't tell anyone you're quirkless" rule was starting to make a wild sort of sense. Because if Sir Night-Eye had been pulling for him as his dad had said, then he'd always been an option. That meant he couldn't tell anyone because they couldn't have him gaining a quirk overnight. Really, it was genius on their part, if a little difficult on his. Everyone who had ever assumed that he'd gotten his father's quirk would just think they were right and move on with their lives. It was so strange to think about it from his parents' side, but it felt so refreshing to finally know why. Why he'd had to clutch his quirklessness so close to his chest with the people he trusted the most. The fact that Sir Night-Eye and Tsukachi knew meant that he could tell Momo and Shudo one day. That had to be enough for now. Because he'd figured that out too. He'd once told Shudo that if he really had Endeavor's quirk, then Endeavor would be running around quirkless. And now he knew All Might would become quirkless eventually, and if his friends knew that All Might was losing his powers, well, put simply, they'd be targets. It was the same reason Momo still didn't know about his father's emaciated condition. So he held this knowledge and he worked. He's 14 and his best friends are actually starting to tease him by calling him Small Might, because of his increase in size when he finally finishes cleaning the beach. He's standing on top of the railing that leads to the beach park and screaming his lungs out. Part of him feels like he's invincible and there's a rush of excitement rolling through him. Friday, and rather late in the evening, the sun is beginning to set and it's almost night in fact, and he'd called his father to come for the pile. Izuku hadn't told him that he'd finished, and when the boy stopped screaming, he could see All Might powered up and standing next to the pile and grinning like it was Christmas morning. He could feel his cheeks stretching from the grin he too was sporting. A sudden laugh bubbled up from his chest, and he jumped from the railing and ran towards his father. The exhilaration of all his work coming to fruition was too much, and he threw himself at the man. All Might easily caught him and lifted him easily and spun them around, laughing his loud and bellowing laugh before chanting, "You did it! You did it!" over and over. Izuku felt on top of the world as his father placed him back on the floor and said, "You've become quite the suitable vessel." He could feel the tears forming in his eyes and tried his best to hold them back, but kept smiling. "Thank you so much for this opportunity. Papa, I still can't believe it." All Might ruffled the boy's hair and smiled. "It seems it's time for your award ceremony." Izuku tried his best to focus. His fervor was now returning. "Right now?" The man nodded and said, "No time like the present." Tears ran down Izuku's face, but they were small and his father just kept smiling and put a hand on the boy's shoulder. All Might plucked a hair from his head and said, "Someone once told me, something you receive because you are lucky and something you are given because you are recognized different in essence. Take that to heart, my son. You earned this through your own hard work." Izuku had nodded, happily wiping the tears from his eyes. While he was slightly confused at the turn events, he concentrated on his father. All Might then offered him the hair and said, "Eat this." He couldn't help it, he screamed, "And oh, that's way too weird, Dad, please." His dad was full-blown laughing, saying, "You have to take in my eat." After a small argument of eat and oh, eat, Izuku finally relented and ate the stupid hair. While he tried to get rid of the phantom feeling of the hair in his throat, his father further explained, "We're going to need a way to try it out safely. Tomorrow after school you will meet me at Gran Torino's for basic training." Izuku looked up suddenly in a rush of confusion. "Isn't that a bit shady?" His father laughed again. Gran Torino lives in a more sparsely populated area and he will provide a controlled environment for you to learn how to exercise the amount of control a child who has just manifested should possess. The next year or so you will have to gradually learn to utilize it in everyday life just as every other teen your age can. We aren't above the law, so we can only really utilize techniques that have been approved of by the government. That made perfect sense to him. He had no idea why he'd even think a little bit otherwise. Izuku was still just towing the starting line now. He looked at his hand, a hand that according to his dad would no longer be quirkless in a few short hours. Suddenly there was a bit of concern that had crept its way into his mind. How do I make sure I don't accidentally discharge it? I mean, I have a whole day with Shochan and Momo in school before I learn how to use it. His father looked a bit surprised, then nervously replied, "Oh yeah." Izuku did his best not to choke on the laugh that wanted to escape. Really, he loved his dad very much, but sometimes. All Might powered down finally as he thought, then replied, "It may sound a bit strange, but when you use my quirk you'll have to squeeze your buttocks and yell this inside your heart, smash." The smash was punctuated by an enthusiastic uppercut and Izuku smiled. That sounds simple enough. So, why the wait to try it out? His father explained, since one for all can be very flashy and volatile, we'll need to be very careful and make sure you won't be hurting anyone or yourself, even if it's accidentally. That also made a lot of sense. Izuku put his chin on his fist and thought a bit about everything he'd just learned. There was an electric current buzzing through him and he wanted to scream, "I have a quirk now." But he was also extremely nervous about the prospect of hurting himself. "Don't worry too much," All Might declared before wrapping an arm around the boy's shoulder. "You've been training for this for a long time. You won't be able to use 100% anytime soon, but you're still very young. I wouldn't be surprised if you were able to access anywhere between 10 to 15% of one for all." Izuku nodded, trying to disperse the nerves that were starting to choke out his excitement. "If you say so." He was so close now, but he still needed to go a little further. He had to calm down. There was a steadily building excitement that had been growing since he'd first told Izuku about one for all. The only thing that had ever rivaled it was when he had inherited one for all from Nana. Nana had once told him there was more happiness when you gave to others than anything else. He had agreed wholeheartedly with that sentiment. But now, at this moment in his life, he wondered if she meant this very feeling. That handing things over to a worthy member of the next generation was the greatest happiness you could feel. Inko, while ecstatic that Izuku would be given such a boon to achieve his dreams, was rather inconsolable. She declared, "I trust you more than anyone else in this world, Toshi, but I won't be calm until I've seen him use that power safely." He understood her. One for all could have some nasty blowback if not controlled properly, and Izuku was still very young. If he was lucky, he'd be able to access about 15%. So teaching him control would be something they really needed to focus on before he used it at all. As the hero prepared to meet his son at Gran Torino's, he tried to think of a way to explain how one for all worked. Really, Izuku was very smart, but he also had a bit of a hard time understanding certain concepts that weren't laid out for him. Sighing, he looked at Gran Torino and remembered how he himself was trained. No, he really hoped they didn't have to resort to anything that brutal. Toshinori looked to his side and found Inko, his wonderful wife, was all set to go. She would be watching them today and they had to make sure they got this 100% right. He and Inko arrived at Gran Torino's home much earlier than their son. They hoped to go over the lesson plan before Izuku arrived. Gran Torino greeted them enthusiastically, saying, "You're just in time for a snack. So let's eat some taiyaki before we get down to business." Inko smiled and nodded, and Toshinori just accepted that eating taiyaki was mandatory before any type of activity for his teacher. His wife happily sat at the dining table. They had done this often, and it was a situation that Inko was more than familiar with. Gran Torino took a seat across from her and Toshinori went to the microwave, as he was practically expected by now, to get the food that was no doubt almost ready. When he removed the taiyaki from the microwave, he placed it on the heat-proof cloth that was at the center of the table. He then took his seat and his mentor dug in. Gran Torino was 2 taiyaki down when he finally decided it was time to speak. "Now then, Inko, what do you have to say about all this?" Inko smiled nervously as expected. It wasn't that she was against the whole thing, but she'd made it clear from the beginning that she was worried for Izuku's safety. I'm so happy Izuku has such an opportunity to fulfill his dream. But I don't want to see him get hurt. I know what one for all can do before it's controlled, and I don't like it. Gran Torino, of course that's understandable. But Izuku is at a point where that shouldn't be too much of an issue as long as he'd been given proper instruction. After all, Toshinori never had too much trouble, so I'm sure your boy won't either. The woman nodded. Her hopefulness was rather obvious, but she remained a tad nervous, and Toshinori couldn't blame her. He was a bit jittery himself. You have another location for this planned, right? He asked. I don't know if your house is really a good place for this sort of thing. Gran Torino laughed at his question, and Toshinori felt a bit offended. It had been a valid concern. The retired hero shook his head. Of course, do you think I'm senile? A wave of embarrassment came over him and blushed and scratched his nose in an attempt to avoid eye contact. Well, I was just concerned for you. Inko placed a comforting hand on his and smiled. She was obviously a bit humored by the situation, which caused him to blush a bit more. Really? Gran Torino continued. I have an area chosen. It's not too far from here and we won't be bothered. It's a bit out of the way, but I'm sure that's for the best. After all, the goal of today isn't destruction but control. Toshinori nodded. His mentor had most probably chosen an abandoned building. All Might silently wondered how many favors he called in to be permitted such a thing if that was the case. They discussed what they planned for the day, and before Toshinori knew it, Izuku was at the door. The chills were back at full force, and Toshinori had to breathe and hold his wife's hand to get himself calmed. After Izuku gave his parents the customary hello hugs, Gran Torino fed Izuku some taiyaki, the boy changed into his running suit, and then the four of them were out the door and on their way to Gran Torino's secure location. Once they arrived at the building Gran Torino had allocated for them, Toshinori examined it closely. It was indeed abandoned as he'd presumed, but it seemed sturdy enough and provided adequate privacy for them. Izuku was bouncing up and down as he tended to do when nervous or excited, and All Might smiled and ruffled his son's hair. All right. You're going to need to stretch out before we start. Izuku nodded and began his regular full-body warm-up. Now Izuku, don't be surprised if you can't use 100% of one for all yet. He began. Izuku looked to him from his place on the floor, stretching his quads. Don't push yourself and just do what you can. He looked to Gran Torino and the man nodded once, and Toshinori honestly felt relieved. Admittedly, he was kind of terrified that if he did this wrong the man would get upset, and he really didn't want an upset Gran Torino on his hands. Izuku seemed thoughtful, then changed positions before asking, how do I limit it? That was a good question. It may be difficult to explain that without you knowing how 100% feels. But we don't want to risk you hurting yourself if we have the time to do this right. You really just have to feel it out, focus on an image in your head and use that as a gauge. Izuku was starting to look confused. What kind of image? This isn't really making sense. Gran Torino was the one who replied this time. That's because you've never used it. You'll only really know how it feels once you activate it. That's why this is pretty tricky. If you do end up hurting yourself, we don't have anyone on standby. I suppose we could take a trip to Recovery Girl, but that's only in case of an extreme emergency, do you understand? Izuku finally stood up and nodded. So I'll have to activate one for all, then try to judge it from there? That sounds difficult, but I think I can try. Gran Torino finally left his place, stooped on debris, and joined them, all the time shaking his head. We promised your mother we'd do our best for you not to injure yourself. You're not too far behind the physical condition your father was when he inherited, so if you do get injured it will be pretty bad. Nothing will explode or anything, but broken bones are no joking matter, boy. Izuku nodded again and seemed to concentrate on the words Gran Torino was saying. And while Toshinori agreed it was going to be pretty difficult to teach him control when he hadn't even done it yet, suddenly Toshinori had an idea. Izuku, his son gave him his attention, and so he continued. Do you remember when you were little and I told you that you couldn't use the gym equipment because you might get hurt? And do you remember how careful we were when we started adding weight to find what you could and couldn't handle? Suddenly a light went on in the boy's eyes and Gran Torino smirked. That's a good analogy. We're doing the same thing here. You're going to have to gauge what power level you can handle without hurting yourself the same way you measured how much weight you can lift. Izuku frowned then. Really, Izuku hadn't expected that learning to use his quirk would be easy, and he appreciated that his dad and grandpa were doing their best to prevent him from getting hurt. But they had given him a lot to be thinking about for his first try. The abandoned building they were in was adding a bit to his nerves, and the fact that both his parents and grandpa were watching him made his drive to succeed a bit inflated. The weightlifting metaphor made a lot of sense and had cleared up what they had been trying to describe when they were talking about feeling it out. He knew perfectly well what pushing your limit felt like when it came to weightlifting, and it left a pretty nasty strain on your muscle, so, yeah, he'd like to not tear or strain something. He was starting to get even more nervous than before. What with all the preparation, and his mother, who was sitting on the sidelines in a chair that had been brought to her, was wringing her hands together and was getting worse and worse the longer they took. So, Izuku began trying to puzzle the whole thing out and make sure he understood properly. I'm going to activate one for all, and try to make sure I don't hurt myself by feeling out my limits like I would when lifting weights? Both men nodded. Izuku wondered if they were going to continue with explaining before his father said, "Well, I suppose you should try it out now." Suddenly Izuku was 10 times more nervous than when he hadn't been given any advice at all. Just as he was going to ask how, his grandpa asked, "So which one of us do you want to try and hit?" Izuku jolted at the question, "Hit? What are you talking about? That's dangerous, isn't it?" He heard his father heave a heavy sigh, but Gran Torino carried on. "Well, considering the fact we're trying to keep your injuries to a minimum, it's the best we have. Your father was able to use one for all normally from the start, but his situation was different and he was older than you are now. I'm hoping that if you have one of us as a target, your reluctance to cause either of us any real harm will help you control it on your first go. Of course, once you've used it, control will come much easier. But what if I hit you?" Izuku practically screamed. Of course he was panicking now, then his brain was catching up. "You just said that was the point though." Ugh. He ran his hands through his hair and began mumbling to himself, weighing his two options for the test run, and came to a decision. Dad had less of a chance of getting hurt, right? Gran Torino nodded, then said, "So I guess you're going to try and hit me then." "That's not what I meant." Izuku screeched, but the retired hero shook his head and headed for the center of the room. It was completely cleared and ideal for this. His grandpa turned to face him. "You may have meant to choose your father, but the fact that you think he won't get hurt makes your choice obsolete. You must be concerned that you may hurt me. Don't worry too much, Izuku. In fact, I trained with your dad exactly like this, so I know better than anyone what a good hit of one for all feels like." Finally his father offered words of comfort. "Izuku, if Gran Torino really thinks that he's in any danger, he will move. He will be okay no matter what the outcome is." Izuku tried his best to calm the sudden sickness he was feeling when he turned to face his grandpa, who just called out, "Remember, you're not aiming for destruction, just to get a feel for the quirk." In an attempt of confidence, Izuku strode over to the cleared area that was occupied by Gran Torino, and halfway there began to run and ped his right fist back. He clenched and felt a sudden rush of power into his arm. When it began to strain too much, he did his best to let go of and pull back on the power until it no longer hurt, before he screamed, smash, and swung for the retired hero. The enormous amount of pressure and heat in his arm made him feel a bit wobbly. When he swung his arm, he could hear a whooshing noise fill the air. Then suddenly the scattered bits of rock and debris that had been around him were flying everywhere. The force of the punch had caused a gust of air that was blowing the rock chunks in every direction. His grandpa's face contorted just moments before he jumped out of the way and dodged the hit. When it was over, he immediately glanced toward Gran Torino, who just gave him a thumbs up with a wicked grin, and then to his mother, who was now gone from her chair. After the dust had settled, his eyes found her by the doorway which they had entered from. His father was powered up and holding her bridal style way from the mess. Izuku suddenly remembered his arm and looked at it. While being really red, it seemed a bit swollen and it was throbbing with heat. He tried to flex his hand and found it rather stiff, like he'd strained it, and it felt like electricity was running up his arm. Holy shit! Feeling a mix of overwhelming happiness that he'd at least been able to do it, mixed with pain in his arm and concern for his mother, he held his arm close to his body and jogged over to his family. "Are you all right, Mom?" All Might put her down gently, then powered down. His mother patted her husband on the arm and kissed him on the cheek before replying to her son, "I'm perfectly fine. Your father was just making sure I didn't get dust on me. Oh Izuku, I'm so proud of you, but you seem like you hurt yourself." She turned to his dad with a rather irritated look, and he began trying to soothe her, and Izuku felt a bit bad that he couldn't get it right on the first try. Suddenly Gran Torino was hovering around him and inspecting his arm carefully for a few moments and declared, "You've also strained quite a few muscles, but overall it's nothing that can't heal in a few weeks." Izuku nodded and his dad sighed in relief and asked, "Do you have a good image of what it feels like now?" Izuku thought back on the pressure of the power that had coursed through him and smiled. "I felt like a BGMI or like an egg in a microwave about to explode." The man laughed and began a coughing fit before calming down and saying, "It's kind of plain, but if it works, it works. Just don't let the egg explode and you'll be fine." His grandpa, however, eyed the two of them and announced, "Well, time for a crash course." His father began coughing and sputtering, but Gran Torino explained, "You need to pull back and quick. You only have a couple days to learn at least some basic control before you have to go back to school. Think back to your elementary days. There were tons of accidents with quirks, weren't there? But they were weak and easily dealt with. We can't risk that sort of thing happening." Izuku nodded. He kind of recalled when people in his kindergarten were manifesting, mainly Kachin setting fire to things and people just being amazed. "I get that. But I don't want to have to try and hit you again." The hero stopped coughing and gathered his wits back up, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Don't worry about that anymore. You've proven you can use it with some semblance of control. Of course it's nowhere near perfect, but you can't expect it to work immediately at your age. I'll get you wrapped up and your arm put into a sling for now. There are some exercises that we can do that don't require your arm." As promised, his arm was wrapped, then placed carefully in a sling. The entire time his mother watched, and Izuku felt a lump in his throat. She was smiling softly at him, and there was the beginning of tears in her eyes. Arms secured and overwhelmed with emotion, Izuku hugged her. The woman embraced him for a long moment before they parted. Both had tears in their eyes. His father just watched them. His mother then frowned and said, "Be careful. Do your best to make sure this is the worst of it." Izuku didn't know what to say, so he just nodded and sniffled a bit before wiping away the tears that had gathered. The woman then turned to All Might. "So, Toshi, what's the verdict?" His father rubbed the back of his neck and replied, "I suppose looking at the damage you're utilizing about 15% with that blow." 15% that made Izuku pause and stare at the man and the area that had been cleared of rubble from the pressure of the impact. His stomach was suddenly in his throat. It really hadn't hit him that he'd have the same monstrous amount of strength as All Might until that very moment. It was a bit to take in. His dad continued speaking, "You shouldn't need 100% anytime soon, so don't worry. You'll work slowly towards it. So how do you feel now?" Izuku nodded and sighed. "My arm kind of feels like jelly. Like I did an arm workout without warming up, or like I only went for a run with one leg, except it's my arm. If I use it anymore it will probably be bad. There's a lot of power in one swing. How would I move it around quickly though? Is that something that comes with practice?" His grandpa shook his head. "Then you'll have to pull back some more till you're solidly at around 10% so that there's no strain. As for everything else, it's a problem you'll have to work out, Izuku. If you want we can have a quick game of quirk tag right here and you can think it over. Just make sure not to overuse your right arm." All Might made a choking noise that confused him, and his mother was patting him on the back and whispering something that seemed to calm him down. Izuku agreed, then turned to Gran Torino. "All right then, I want to learn everything I can here before I have to go back home. I won't be able to train like this there, and I feel like I'll learn better if it's on my feet." Grandpa nodded. "All right then, I want you to do your best to catch me. This is a basic game a lot of kids play when they first manifest, so it shouldn't be too hard, okay? And remember, one for all is just a quirk you inherited from your dad just like every other kid. Yours was just a bit delayed and more direct, you hear?" Nodding, Izuku got into a running stance and they began. Shudo Todoroki found himself once again ensconced in a private booth in the favored barbecue restaurant of him and his friends. Momo was already present and they had ordered some drinks, a few starting plates of meat they knew all three of them enjoyed. Izuku on the other hand was running a bit late and had sent them a text in their group chat that he was on his way and taken a picture of the street signs of a cross-section that was only a couple of blocks from the meeting place. Momo was oozing worry at the fact that in his text, Izuku had apologized for sleeping in. That was fine to Shudo. Izuku's training had seemed so strenuous, and since it was a rest day, Shudo wasn't going to argue with his friend sleeping until. As for Momo, while she wasn't a bleeding heart, she tended to wear more of her heart on her sleeve than Shudo did. Her reaction wasn't out of place. After all, Izuku had been closing in on himself for some time and Shudo had no idea what he and Momo were supposed to do. When Izuku finally arrived at their booth, it was before the meet and after the drinks. Only Shudo found he didn't care about that anymore. His friend was moving slower than usual, and while Izuku wore a smile, Shudo found his eyes fixed on the arm that the other boy had cradled in a sling. His thoughts were racing now. How did Izuku manage to injure himself? It couldn't possibly have been during training. All Might would never let the boy strain himself too much, and Mrs. Yagi would have both Izuku's and the pro hero's hides if they pushed it too far. It was Momo who spoke first, and she was beginning to look as distressed as Shudo was feeling when she said, "Izuku, what on earth happened?" Izuku did his best to give them a reassuring smile, one that neither of them were really going to buy with how well they knew him, and slid into the booth while trying to brush his injuries off, saying, "It's nothing. I just strained my arm a bit while training, but it's okay." The skeptical look on Momo's face was seconded by Shudo. After all, Izuku knew his limits well, and while muscle strains were normal, needing a sling wasn't exactly nothing. "We're just worried you've been pushing yourself too hard." Shudo tried to reason with his friend. "First the regimen from hell, then you started cutting down on hanging out with us, and now your arm's in a sling." Shudo could see the change in Izuku's eyes immediately. The other boy was instantly resigned, but his smile didn't waver as Shudo continued speaking his concerns. "We just want to make sure you're okay. We're friends after all." Casting a glance to Momo, Shudo was comforted to see that she was now wearing a determined expression, one that most likely meant that she was ready to argue the point alongside him if needed. It brought a warmth to his chest. They had done and would do the same for him. It was the least Shudo could do in return for Izuku. He watched as Izuku nodded in understanding and seemed to gather his thoughts before replying with an even voice, "It's just a strained muscle. I only have to rest it for a couple weeks or so and it'll be fine, and now that I've reached my weight goal, my workouts are going back to normal. I'm sorry I made you both so worried." It wasn't what Shudo had been looking for, but the promise that Izuku's workouts were slowing down again was enough for him. Nevertheless, it seemed Momo's determination was greater than his own when she spoke again. This time her voice was similar to the concerned tone Mrs. Yagi would use when she told the three of them not to be climbing the tree in the Yagi's yard. "I'm glad you're slowing down, but that doesn't tell us how it happened. Izuku, you couldn't have gotten hurt that badly lifting weights. What on earth have you been doing?" Momo was frowning and her eyes were shining, and Shudo was beginning to realize that perhaps Momo was stronger than him. "It's kind of embarrassing." Izuku sighed. "I kind of don't actually want to share the story right now." In the thoughtful silence that followed, the food arrived and Shudo's thoughts were just more confused with the confession. After all, Izuku told them about All Might lifting him in the grocery store and nearly dropping him on his head. What could be more mortifying than that? Momo was obviously reluctant to accept the reply, but Izuku's smile finally fell and Shudo watched as Momo finally conceded with, "Fine, keep your secrets, I'll keep worrying though." She then began cooking her meat with the tongs on the table, and Izuku's voice broke as he cried out, "Emma-chan, don't keep worrying. I'm fine." Shudo decided then that it was best to probably try and change the subject. They weren't getting anywhere and it was going to lead to an argument if he didn't act. "Izuku probably just got dropped by All Might again, Emo-chan. It's nothing to worry about, he's sturdy." Izuku looked to him and Shudo gave him a small smile, and Izuku almost looked like he was going to cry before he laughed. "You'll never let me forget about that, will you?" At last, Momo laughed too. "If he's not going to let me forget the accidental bomb, he's not going to let you forget something like that." The atmosphere was clearing again and becoming almost as light as it had been before Izuku had gotten so busy. Shudo hoped that they could get back what they had before. It had almost been a whole year, and whatever had caused Izuku to close into himself was hopefully resolved. They spoke on safer topics, the upcoming finals for their second years, and mostly. Shudo hoped in his heart that they could once again talk about deeper things with Izuku, but that was the other boy's choice to make. Except, Izuku had always been like a bridge between the trio, like the glue that held them together. For them to drift apart from him. Shudo tried his best not to consider the possible fate of their friendship. Nothing truly bad had happened yet, and Shudo prayed it stayed that way. After they had eaten, instead of hanging out at an arcade or window shopping as they normally did on their Sundays, the trio ended up going separate ways. Finals were coming up and they all needed to study and get ready for their third year in junior high. Their last year before they could all be in school together. Yaoyorozu Momo wasn't an idiot. Izuku had avoided an important conversation at lunch, one that had been building for the better part of their lives, and Shudo had helped him deflect it. As she walked home, Momo could help but wonder if Shudo knew more about Izuku's mysterious life than she did. They did spend more time together at school, and the only time she ever saw him anymore was on Sundays, and over a computer screen on Wednesdays. Even then, Izuku would occasionally cancel his plans with them just so he could do whatever it was he did. It was fine, she had plenty to do with her time away from them. Momo was working on more intricate electronic devices, and it was taking more time than her academic studies to figure out how to make a complex labyrinth of circuits and code the microchips she would need to put into her machines. Momo was practically taking an engineering course independently, and it occupied enough of her time that she hardly thought about what was going on in the lives of her friends. To her that was fine, because she had always figured that if they were having troubles they would talk about it. But now, with Izuku showing up exhausted, bruised, practically out of commission, and with his mouth glued shut on the matter, she was second-guessing that belief. Shudo had helped Izuku cover up whatever he was covering up, whether it was because Izuku trusted Shudo with the information or because Shudo wanted to prevent an argument was up in the air. It pained her in her heart to say that maybe it wasn't any of her business anyways. To her surprise, upon entering the foyer of the main entrance hall, her father was lounging in the main living room just off to the left. Momo hadn't expected either of her parents to be home until the evening, and to see her father so casually drinking tea and reading the paper in the middle of the day after the luncheon she just had was a bit of a shock to her system. For his part, her father seemed equally surprised to see her when he said, "Momo, you're back sooner than I thought you would be." Normally Momo would just say, "Finals are coming up and we all are taking the day to study," and they'd have left it at that. Her relationship with her father wasn't strained, but it also wasn't exactly flourishing like some people she knew. Perhaps it was because she felt like she had no one else to talk to, or maybe it was an attempt to reach out to him, but Momo instead said, "Izuku's been having a bit of a rough time and I think none of us were really up to more than lunch." Suddenly the man put his paper down and seemed more open than he did before. "Did you want to talk about it?" Without warning, everything came rushing out as Momo practically collapsed into the sofa chair across from her father. "I feel like Izuku doesn't trust me anymore. We used to be so close and now it feels like I barely know what's going on with him now." Her hands were trembling and she felt like such a baby. She could feel the warmth of the tears forming until they grew heavy on her cheeks and fell. Her father just sat there uselessly and watched her cry, all the while looking more out of his element than she'd ever seen him before. But Momo wasn't done yet as she covered her mouth to prevent a sob and continued, "I just want to help. I don't want him to feel like he has to do it all on his own. I don't know what to do." Momo stared at her still shaking hands and tried not to break down further. After a brief moment of silence her father began to finally speak. Her eyes darted up and suddenly there was a pain of uneasiness in her gut. "Yagi is the son of the #1 hero, darling." Her father smiled and Momo instantly regretted saying anything. The feeling grew even stronger when he continued with, "He probably feels like he has the world on his shoulder and, well, he's a young man now and I'm not really surprised that he probably doesn't feel like you can understand him." His voice was sickeningly tender as if he was trying to break an ugly truth to her, like he was doing her a favor saying such awful things. Her silence permitted him to conclude with, "It will be okay, you'll see, you'll make more friends in no time." As if he hadn't heard a single word she'd said, as if this hurdle was enough for her to abandon the first friend she'd ever made. Momo's mind was screaming at her that she should say something, but as much as her throat burned, The tears kept flowing and she was trapped in knowing that even if she said something it too would probably get lost in translation. She had forgotten why she never went to her parents for these things, why it was hurting so much that she felt like she couldn't talk to her friend. Momo began drying her own tears as she did her best to steady her own breathing. With a new resolve she decided she'd vent to Shudo later. He'd listen, he'd tell her whether he actually knew more or not, even if he wasn't permitted to share the details. So Momo let her father stand and pat her on the head and say, "Your mother told me that you'd been having a hard time since you only had boys for friends, but if I'd known it was so bad I would have stopped it sooner, with acid-laced honey." That was enough to pull her from her own thoughts, and before she could even think she replied, "My friendships are fine, Dad. We just had an argument, everything's okay." He looked skeptical and Momo felt bad for practically breaking down one moment and the next shoving all her feelings down just to comfort her father and make sure he didn't do anything rash. Why she felt bad, Momo wasn't sure, but she'd examine it later when she didn't have a bottled hurricane trying to break out of her chest. Finally her dad smiled wryly and sighed, "Well, if you says so, your mother's always been better at these things after all. But if I find out those boys are mistreating you, I'm going to have a good talk with their fathers. You may be in training to be a hero, but you're a girl. They should know better." Briefly the mental image of her rather average-looking father trying to scold Endeavor and All Might came into her head, and she clamped her lips together and stayed silent. It was stupid really, to be thinking about something so childish, but she knew after the afternoon she'd just have it was better to keep her thoughts to herself. Momo rose finally and rushed as quickly as was polite to her room. Silently she swore to herself to never again share herself like that with her parents. They cared for her, they supported her in her path to become a hero, and in an abstract way they loved her as their precious daughter, but they had never really taken the time to actually connect with her. Actually no, that was wrong. From what Momo could tell, her parents seemed to pick and choose facets of her, and whatever parts they liked were used to build the image who she was in their minds. Everything else about her seemed to be thrown out as unimportant or trivial. It was infinitely frustrating. Perhaps, she thinks, that's why she never understood Izuku's relationship with his parents. It dawned on Momo as she closed the door to her room and laid on her bed haphazardly that perhaps Izuku wasn't carrying the weight of whatever was bothering him alone. What if he felt like having his parents was enough? Where did that leave her and Shudo? Toshinori watched Izuku dry his face in a clean red towel. The boy had just finished swimming laps and it was about time for the beach park to start getting more visitors. So he tossed his son the duffel they'd shoved his clothes in before their session, and Izuku caught it with ease and a smile. Ever since Izuku had come home early from his Sunday that was usually set aside for his friends, Toshinori had known something was wrong. Sure enough, his son had confessed to him that they'd had a sort of, not argument about his injury, and that his intense schedule along with all the secrecy had began putting a strain on his friendship with Todoroki and Yayorozu. For the first time since he was a teenager, Toshinori wished he'd had more friends as a kid and was able to help Izuku more with these sort of things. Toshinori had friends now, but when he inherited One for All, there wasn't anyone in his life that would have had to be kept out of the loop. To see the situation tear at his son's friendships made him feel such an immense guilt for not having enough foresight in the matter. Didn't help him with the fact that he had no idea what to do about the situation. Izuku may have had enough emotional and physical support from him and Inko, but friendships with people his age were priceless. Toshinori didn't want to damage them. He knew that they provided Izuku with a stability and interchange of encouragement that nothing else could replace. On top of all that, they were planning a move. Toshinori and his wife were already home shopping and narrowing down what schools Izuku could attend. Planning more changes to their lives, and Izuku's dearest friends didn't know. Toshinori couldn't help but feel it was eating his up from the inside, and soon it would all come pouring out if something wasn't done. So Toshinori did the only thing he knew would help, for better or worse. As he walked with his son from the beach and considered his own life and all the mistakes he felt he was making as a parent and hero, he clapped his son on the back and declared, "You've reached the point in your training that I'm no longer too worried about your control. Only time, age, and schooling will improve your abilities." His heart clenched as Izuku turned to look at him. The boy practically had stars in his eyes as he excitedly said, "Do you think it would be okay to bring it up with Sho-chan and Emo-chan then?" I mean, they've been wondering for so long and I know I can't tell them I was born quirkless, but this is the next best thing. Izuku began practically waxing poetic about quirk talk sessions he could have with his friends and what he could say, what he couldn't. Finally Toshinori placed a calming hand on his son's hair and laughed. "Can you slow down?" Izuku froze and blushed brightly. His eyes were shining and in that moment he looked so much like his mother that Toshinori's heart felt like it held the sun. "Sorry. I've just wanted to tell them so much and ask them so much." Izuku trailed off and sighed as if in disappointment. "Well then." Toshinori continued his original thought. "Yes, you can tell them about your quirk." Quickly, the boy lit up like a firecracker and before he could express his joy Toshinori delivered another gift. "And you can tell them about us moving after all, after your mother and I will be taking a trip soon to look at homes, there'll be no point to hiding it anymore." Without warning Toshinori found his own thin and frail frame engulfed by his rather large son, who was crying joyfully, "Papa," and nothing else. He found himself hugging the boy in return. It was the least he could do, with all that he'd asked of the boy. After his dad had given the go-ahead to tell his friends almost everything, Izuku felt like the weight of the world fell away. Being honest with himself, he knew that keeping those secrets from his friends were killing him. Every time he talked with them, he felt like some sort of villain. He'd been so open and honest with them about so many things in his life it felt like he was betraying them by keeping such life-changing information from them. Izuku understood why he had to do it, of course. That didn't mean he had to like it. The biggest surprise came when he was planning what to say the next time they spoke, which would be a study Wednesday, and he found himself truly hit with the fact that he most likely wouldn't see his friends in person for an entire year. Of course he'd known and realized this from the beginning, but telling his friends, after the way things had been between them recently, he wondered if it would just be easier for them to just let him go. The thought made Izuku's mouth taste like chalk and he hated himself for thinking his friends would be so fickle. But it would be what he deserved. He had kept so much from them and then acted like nothing was wrong. They knew better, of course. They knew something was up and he just went along acting like nothing was and treated them like idiots. Izuku pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes and did his best not to cry as he thumbed his way through the several junior high school pamphlets his mother had given him. He would have to choose a school soon. The general neighborhood they would be moving to had already been decided and there was a half-dozen homes that his mom and dad would be leaving to look at during his winter break. The entire family had already begun packing their things and Izuku felt once again like an awful friend for how close he was cutting it with this reveal. Izuku tried not to think of how much of a chance he had of his friends hating him after this and strove to focus on his school options. His mind kept going back to Shudo and Momo, who he felt like he'd abandoned. Momo, for whom Shudo and he were the only real emotional support network she had. Shudo, who had a monster of a father and he'd practically ignored just to feel sorry for himself. It made Izuku's stomach churn. Izuku looked at his behavior for the past few months and hated what he'd done. It was easy to see he just curled in on himself and hurt his friends beyond what he could probably repair. He felt pathetic as he stared at the pamphlets for Sumai and Aderon. What school he chose mattered little in the end as long as it was close to home to maximize his workout time. Izuku put the pamphlets down and sighed. He wasn't going to get anything done like this. Telling his friends would have to come first, he decided. It was the more important of the two tasks and there was no way Izuku would have a clear head until he righted what he'd wronged. Inko knew for a fact that she'd never ever stop worrying about either of the men in her life and she was 100% secure in knowing that they would look after her as well. Evidence of this was the fact that Izuku was currently making dinner as she relaxed and looked at things she could put on the list for Toshi to buy for her when their anniversary rolled around again in the winter. Her precious son was cooking chopped vegetables in a pan as he waited for the katsu to finish frying. The rice cooker had been set to warm, since it had finished cooking only a few minutes ago. Finding a particularly appealing ikebana vase, Inko saved it to her list and continued looking for more accessories for her hobbies. Not for the first time she thought about how she would need to transplant her favorite plants from the back garden. If she could, Inko would happily take all of them including the tree. But alas, she had to be realistic and knew that only 1 or 2 flowering bushes would do. That didn't mean she wasn't going to take trimmings and attempt to regrow some of her other plants. When they had first discussed the move, Inko had entertained the notion of perhaps contacting some of her old acquaintances, then promptly decided that if they were god friends then she would still be in contact with them now. Still, it felt slightly rude not to at least try. Shrugging it off, she decided to take a page from her husband's book and decided to just be a little rude for her own well-being. After all, there was no telling what anyone who knew her back then thought of her now. The scandal of All Might being married had been national news, and she wasn't about to stir up her life even further just because it felt rude not to contact old neighbors. Inko added a few more Ikebana accessories to her wish list as the smell of dinner wafted into the dining room. Izuku was singing along with his phone, which was playing some upbeat tune. She sipped her tea and just basked in the relaxed atmosphere. It was a welcome change. They'd been so busy with the move, it was absolute heaven to sit and just rest, even just for a little bit. Looking at houses had taken so much out of her. Their current home was purchased with the fact that Tashinori would be living in it alone for most of the year in mind. But those days were far behind them, and finding a home for their family, one that would see her and Toshi retired, and maybe even a few grandkids, wasn't an easy task. Not to mention the fact that Izuku would no doubt want to host study groups with his friends after school when he could. They searched for something with a garden so she could keep up with her flower arrangement, and something that would have an office so that Tashinori would have room for his grading when he became a teacher. Narrowing the search down was no easy feat, and the couple had decided on around 6 homes to visit before settling on a final choice. There was so much to be done, and Inko was glad that she had Izuku to make dinner for their family when she couldn't. Pulling herself from her thoughts, she realized Izuku seemed different somehow. "You seem chipper." She smiled warmly as her son practically danced around the kitchen as he added onions into the soup he'd been preparing alongside the castew and rice. Izuku laughed as he stirred the pot of no doubt a very light soup made with his father in mind. "I just feel a lot lighter now that I don't have to keep so many secrets from my friends." Of course, that would be enough to brighten his mood. He'd been so morose about the situation. Inko was glad his spirits had improved so monumentally. "Have you decided when you're going to tell them?" The boy thoughtfully placed the lid back onto the pot, and his demeanor became more subdued as he replied, "Wednesday." "Are you worried about it?" Inko frowned, wondering what could possibly have him so spooked. "I'm sure they'll take it well. After all, you 3 have always been close." "I haven't exactly been the best friend recently." Izuku sighed and looked at her. He seemed more apprehensive than scared, so Inko did her best to comfort him. "That happens sometimes," she began. "We do things or say things that hurt our friends without meaning to. It's a part of life. You just have to be sure they know you're sorry and do your best to do better." Izuku smiled wryly and turned off the fire underneath the vegetables he'd been steaming. "I just hope they can forgive me." "They will," Inko said with complete confidence. "After all, they're your friends, aren't they?" Izuku's smile softened as he said, "Yeah, they are." When it's finally Wednesday, Izuku is giddy and nauseous all at once, and during class Shudo keeps shooting him glances that, to Izuku, looks like his friend expects him to explode at any minute. Shudo finally asks, and all Izuku can do to keep himself from screaming, "I'm moving and I have a quirk," is laugh like a maniac. The noise is wild and he knows he sounds unhinged. Izuku had been trained to sound welcoming and joyful, but this is all nerves and anxiety. It surprised Izuku when Shudo pat him on the back, stared him dead in the eye, and said, "That's really scary, Izukin," which only caused Izuku to laugh harder. Eventually he was able to gather himself enough to say, "I have some stuff to tell you and Emo-chan when we study. I'm just a bit nervous is all." Shudo was obviously surprised, but stopped looking at him for the rest of the day, which Izuku figured meant the other boy was content with his answer. The rest of the day felt like it was dragging on, and when Izuku finally said his "see you later" to Shudo, he felt like he could barely contain his own nerves over what was to come. How do you tell your friends that you are moving away at a time where you are all so busy you probably won't be able to see each other very much, and then reveal you have a quirk? He knew he could foist the blame on his parents and they probably would welcome the blame, but that didn't quite feel right to him. So, as he announced, "Here I am," to his parents who were in the living room sorting through household paperwork and packing it away, Izuku was trying not to beat himself up too much for not planning past, "Tell my friends everything I can." Both of his parents greeted him happily and he quickly left to his room to set up for his customary video call study session. Throwing his blazer onto his bed, Izuku opened his laptop and pinched his bottom lip between his thumb and index finger, causing it to pucker as he waited anxiously for his computer to boot up. Finally, when everything was ready, he began growing anxious once more as he saw that Shudo and Momo were already in a call. It wasn't as if it was abnormal for two of them to wait for the third, and he admitted to himself that he should be happy that they were already both online. But the gurgling sensation wouldn't leave his stomach as he accepted the invite they had already sent him and joined the call. Almost instantly the faces of his friends filled his screen and Izuku reminded himself that they were some of the most important people in his life and they deserved to know everything he could tell them even if it meant they'd never talk again. After their initial greetings, Shudo tossed out any plans. Izuku had to segue into his announcement naturally as he asked, "So what did you want to tell us?" Izuku froze and smiled on instinct at the question. Apparently Shudo was more curious about it than he'd given him credit for. Doing his best to gather his courage, Izuku replied, "It's actually about some plans my family is making for next year." Momo looked surprised while Shudo remained as stoic as ever, so Izuku decided to just spit it out. "We're moving just outside the Shizuoka prefecture. We've been planning for months and I only just got permission to say anything." "You're what?" Momo gasped. Izuku did his best to smile at her but he knew it wasn't working when she continued, "Why?" "I can't really say why yet. But we're moving during the break before third year." Izuku explained as clearly as he could and hoped that his reluctance was coming across. "I'll have to change schools too. Deveron is already a commute, but from Shizuoka it will be too much of a trip if I want to keep up with my studies and training." "What about our Sundays?" Momo mourned, and Izuku found her sadness touching but it was seriously began to squeeze at his own heart. "It'll be fine." Shudo finally spoke and offered a tentative smile. "It's not like it's forever and we'll all be attending UA for high school so it's really only a year." "That's not for sure though." Izuku confessed to the surprise of both of his friends as he explained, "Only 4 people can get in on recommendations, and while both of you are practically sure shots, I want people to know I got in on my own merit so I'm taking the general entrance exam for the hero course." "You're taking the exam?" Shudo breathed out in what was almost a gasp and Izuku wished suddenly that he wasn't piling so many surprises on them at once but they deserved to know. Blushing, Izuku nodded and prayed they understood. "This I kind of saw coming." Momo confessed, finally seeming more grounded than just moments before. "You've always acted so cagey about getting into UA so I knew something was up. But you'll no doubt do well regardless of what test is." Shudo reasoned, "So there's no reason to act so unsure about your acceptance." It was almost too perfect and Izuku wanted to cry. He couldn't lie to them, heroes should never lie, but he'd have to tell him something. Izuku pressed his bracelet into his wrist and fiddled with the chain as he finally told them what he'd been holding back for what felt like forever. "That would be true if I could use more of my strength during the exam, but right now I have to hold back a lot of it or else I could seriously hurt myself, more than I already did when I had my arm in a sling. My dad even says I could break something if I'm not careful." The silence that followed was so thick and oppressive that it made Izuku tremble. He fiddled with his bracelet again, with the extender he'd had to buy as he'd grown larger and the bracelet had gotten too small. "Well, like I've said before, if your quirk relies on muscle mass you shouldn't have to worry too much as long as you keep increasing your muscle mass." Shudo's answer was delivered with such feigned calmness that Izuku almost laughed hysterically if Momo hadn't started sobbing. The fact that Izuku could tell that Shudo's mind was going 1,000 kilometers a second didn't concern him as much as the fact that Momo had tears streaming down her face in a seemingly unending torrent. Her right hand covered her mouth in an attempt to contain her sobs but the other was clenching at her chest as if in pain. Izuku's stomach began rolling and his skin felt numb at the sight. Finally Momo choked back her sobs enough to say, "Is this why you've been so distant? Is this really all it's been? I've been a horrible friend." Izuku couldn't help the reply and was stunned to feel his own tears suddenly burning at the edges of his eyes and down his cheeks. "I felt like you both deserved better than someone who hid the fact that they had a quirk and was about to just leave without saying anything. I never even stopped to think that I was hurting you. I was so selfish these past months. I'm so sorry, Emo-chan. Shochan too, you both deserve better than to be forced out just because I was feeling bad. I'm sorry I hurt you. Then, Izuku scooted back his chair so they could both see him as he bowed as deeply as he could while sitting. Thank you for putting up with me for so long. I'll do better in the future. Momo laughed then. It was watery and obviously more relieved than humored as she said, we all have secrets, Izuku. Next time just don't let them keep you from your friends. You had me so worried. I thought you didn't trust me anymore. I'm relieved as well, Shudo confessed. I know how trying our lives can be and I was afraid that you no longer wished to be friends. Family secrets, Esike. Izuku groused as he sat up again and wiped away his tears. I was so worried you guys would hate me for how I'd acted, how I'd kept such important things secret. I can't pretend to understand it, Momo sighed. You've always been as secretive as your dad about if you even had a quirk or not. Most people share what their quirk is as quickly as they share their names. Why did you wait so long to tell us? Shudo pondered. You moving is a surprise, but if the reason behind it is still a secret, then I can see why you held up on sharing. But from how tight-lipped your family is about your quirk, it was almost definitely inherited from All Might. So why keep such a lid on the information with your friends? Izuku didn't know what to say. He knew why it was such a secret, but he couldn't tell them. I only just got it. Not yet, at least. It was Momo that saved him. I've always known. Momo gasped, her eyes and face much clearer now. You told me one day while we were watching TV. Even All Might couldn't control his quirk until he was 14. But what kind of quirk is that? Shudo's eyes widened at the information. But what kind of quirk behaves that way? Izuku laughed breathlessly. It was such a strange thing for him to be sitting here talking about his quirk with his friends when they were supposed to be doing homework. I can't go into detail, but it's really hard to manage and it's a mess if you can't. I can only imagine. Shudo frowned as he spoke. Momo made a strange face, and Izuku realized they were trying to imagine him being as strong as his dad. He wondered how they were doing because not even he was able to imagine it just yet. Suddenly Momo squeaked and smiled with almost sadistic glee. That means you really are Small Might. Izuku groaned. They studied for the rest of the evening until it was dinner time. The air between them was lighter and clearer than Shudo could remember it being for some time. All in all, it was a good evening. He wished he could ask a million questions, but Shudo also knew there would be time for that later. Now they needed to repair the damage and distance between them before Izuku moved. Shudo was surprised at the things that Izuku had revealed to them. The fact that his first friend was moving was going to be difficult, but as long as they remained in contact he hoped they would be fine. Like he said before, the three of them would be attending UA and that would bring them closer at the end of the year apart. The fact that Momo had cried was a surprise. She'd been shaken up recently by a conversation she'd had with her father. Shudo didn't know the details, but from what she'd said it seemed to have bothered her greatly. At this point he knew her relationship with her parents wasn't anything like his relationship with Endeavor, but the only other family he had NTMT enough details to really compare it to was Izuku's family, and Shudo wasn't sure that All Might's family was a good touchstone. Momo always seemed to have an odd semi-closeness with her parents while also being distant enough that she felt they couldn't understand her. Overall she was happy with them and Shudo figured they must be average. After all, he couldn't imagine everyone in the world being as close to their parents as Izuku or as at odds with them as Shudo was with Endeavor. He didn't realize that Izuku's emotional distance would have bothered her so much. Then again, she'd been friends with him longer, and perhaps relied on that constancy more than he did. Shudo believed he relied on both his friends fairly equally, so while he was bothered by Izuku's reticence in the past few months, he just hoped it would work out and relied more on Momo. He was concerned of course, but there was nothing he could do if Izuku didn't tell them anything or just decided to leave them. It would hurt, probably more than Shudo was prepared to admit, but it didn't happen and things were going to be getting better now, so it was a non-issue. Now, Shudo thought as he lay in his bed trying to find sleep, now he had to think about what all this meant for him and his future. In the morning, he found himself only half rested from his night fraught with unsettling thoughts and unsure feelings. Shudo knew he'd need to talk to Izuku soon about certain things. There were answers he absolutely needed now that he knew for a fact that Izuku had inherited some version of All Might's quirk. It was like tunnel vision. His heart and mind were zeroed in on the things that had troubled him since he'd first found out about Izuku's life, about how much he loved All Might. He'd vented to Momo several times, and she'd encouraged him to do exactly as he was going to do now. She'd be proud. Shudo dressed for school, prepared as simple breakfast, and was infinitely happy that Fuyumi had decided to leave him be for the morning. Leaving, he took a breath and stepped out, hoping he was ready for what was to come. When he arrived at Deveron Junior High, Shudo found Izuku waiting for him by the gates. A fact that made him more determined in his course. Izuku waved happily and smiled in greeting as he usually did. Knowing him as he did, Shudo could tell he was lighter and more earnest than he'd been in some time. Shudo wasn't a conversationalist, so he gave his friend a good morning and got to the point, hoping that he could get this weight of his chest sooner rather than later. He began with, "I know you only just told us about your quirk, but there's something that's been on my mind since we first met." They had been walking to class together, and Izuku paused his stride to give Shudo his full attention, which he was grateful for. Izuku urged him to continue with a curious, "What is it, Shudo? How do you do it? How do you deal with having your father's quirk? How do you deal with the weight of it?" Shudo knew he was being blunt, but Izuku was normally forgiving and understanding when it came to Shudo's particular oddities. Izuku seemed to be in thought, his expression was serious, and Shudo felt like a million ants were crawling up his spine in anticipation of the other boy's reply. "It's heavier than I probably know," Izuku finally replied, "but I don't view it as a burden really. To me it's more like a sacred torch that's been passed to me, entrusted to me. It's not just his power anymore, it's mine too now." Shudo stared at his friend like he was seeing him for the first time. "I can't feel the same way about my fire side." Izuku frowned then. "Shudo, you know it's okay to feel unsure. I've felt completely undeserving sometimes, but ultimately it's your power and Endeavor doesn't have a say in how you use it." "I can't." Shudo shook his head. "I can't feel that way. He's done too much. I feel too much." Finally his friend sighed and smiled again. "I'll ignite that spark in you one day, and when that day comes I hope we can truly understand each other." While he didn't think that day would ever truly come, Shudo found himself looking forward to it. After school and homework was done, Izuku was packing up the bits of the kitchen that were seldom used. He couldn't help but feel he could have said something more to Shudo when he asked about his quirk. They hadn't seen eye to eye for so long on the matter of Shudo's fireside, and while Izuku knew that it was Shudo's choice in the end, he felt like he needed to help him and save him from the path he was walking. It seemed so clear to Izuku that Shudo would be so much stronger using both facets of his quirk, and since Endeavor really couldn't control what Shudo did with his quirk, then he didn't matter. Of course Izuku was no stranger to emotional baggage. His entire life before moving to Tokyo was something that he'd taken years to come to terms with. It took him until he was 12 to admit that the teachers in his old schools had wronged him, and when he was 13 he finally came to terms with the fact that Kachin, as much as he'd admired the other boy, hadn't actually been his friend since they'd been. Izuku understood that it would take time and maybe even distance for Shudo to realize that he didn't need to hold himself back to be a hero. Even so, he couldn't help but feel that he should have done more for his friend. Izuku finished stacking the larger stoneware into the box and closed it. Cautiously he reached for his power as he'd been training and accessed about 5% of One for All as he lifted the heavy package that was about the same size as him and carried it into the living room almost effortlessly. Cautiously he placed the box down next to the other boxes they had already packed and deactivated his quirk with a sigh. "You're getting really good at that." Toshinori smiled brightly and Izuku returned his grin. At first it had felt weird to use One for All in such a mundane and frivolous way. But his father reminded him that it was just like any other quirk to be used whenever it was needed, and the weights and machines in the dojo were going to be ridiculously difficult to move if he didn't use his quirk. So Izuku had relented and used the packing as an exercise in control while his dad watched to make sure he'd be okay. After that he'd been approved to use it in his daily life as long as it was legal and he wasn't being lazy. It was honestly still a bit mind-blowing to him that he had a quirk, and he used it sparingly still, but he figured that was okay. "It's all the practice I've been getting with moving all the heavy stuff." Izuku sat on the couch gingerly and stretched his arms. His dad happily joined him and they sat in a comfortable silence. The house was a bit of a mess with all the cleaning and the packing. They had been donating anything they didn't use, and because of that it would take a fraction longer to pack everything, but it really didn't matter in the end. Izuku just hoped he didn't have to give up all of his All Might shirts that he'd outgrown. School was only about 2 weeks from ending, and their time in Izuku's semi-childhood home was drawing to a close. He'd miss it, but he was looking forward to the new memories they could make in their new home. Before you know it, you'll be just as good as even young Todoroki and Yaoyorozu are with their quirks. His father praised. Izuku couldn't help but blush at the compliment. It was true, his hard work was paying off. Who knew how far he'd go? One thing was for sure though. In just another year he'd be taking the UA entrance exam as his ultimate test. Thinking of his friends, Izuku said, "I'm trying to get Shochan to use his fire side, but I just can't get him, so see, it's his quirk and not Endeavor's. We still can't see eye to eye about it, but I just feel like there's more I could have done to convince him." Sometimes people believe what they want no matter what anyone else says. His father sighed. It's admirable you're trying to help your friend, but sometimes people won't change their mind about things until they are truly ready and in a place where they can accept a new truth. As long as you keep at it, I'm sure you'll break through to him. The last part was punctuated with a hand in his son's hair and a smile on his face. Izuku couldn't help but feel warm and loved, as he always did when he was with his dad or mom. "He's handicapping himself though," the man finally said. "He'll never surpass anyone, not even Endeavor, if he's only going to be using half his strength." Izuku agreed. There was a day in which their activities lulled, and Toshinori, in a fit of sentimentality, after kissing his wife goodbye, dragged Izuku out of bed at an ungodly hour in the morning and took him to Shinabazu Pond in Ueno Park. Izuku laughed as they ate their breakfast at a hole-in-the-wall shop and made their way to a park that was now carved into Toshinori's heart. The place he'd planned to take his son for summer while he was still well, the place Gran Torino had to tour Izuku around in his steed, already almost 4 years ago. They walked in near silence, just enjoying the company of one another, enjoying the calm before what was surely to be a storm. The Yagi family was once again on the cusp of change. This time it was one they had made themselves, but it was just as big and important as the last one. Toshinori watched his son and let the affection he felt for the boy warm him. Izuku was practically bounding around and enjoying nature to its fullest. They were so much alike, but just different enough to bring Toshinori to his knees. Izuku truly was the best of both him and Inko. "How are you holding up?" Toshinori prodded gently. His son had been having it rough until recently, and now that they were practically packed and set to leave almost any day now, he wanted to make sure his boy was in a good place. "I'm nervous," Izuku confessed as he stared at the trees that were now devoid of leaves. "I'm starting over again, and I don't know how to feel about it." "It's only a soft reset," Toshinori reminded him. "This time you have friends to keep up with, and even though we'll be in a new place, you'll have your routines to keep you grounded." Izuku nodded, wearing a soft and thoughtful smile that looked so much like Inko's that Toshinori felt his heart squeeze. "It'll be okay as long as you and Mom are here." Izuku smiled. And it was. It had felt like tearing his own heart out when Izuku said goodbye to his friends. Of course it wasn't forever, but he'd be going from seeing Shudo in person almost every day to only a few times a month. Momo he only saw in person once a week on Sundays was also reduced to the same thing. Izuku had to keep reminding himself it was only temporary, and if he worked hard enough and kept his training up, they'd all be going to school together as first years in UA. The new house was modern yet traditional, just like his parents'. It wasn't as large as the Yaoyorozu's, but it was still a substantial chunk of land that was located in a more residential and almost rural section of the city. Their location granted them privacy from nosy neighbors, but also quick access to Tetuan Shopping Center should they take a train or bus. Izuku had promised his friends a video tour as soon as they had gotten settled and was keen on delivering on that promise. His room was bigger now, and he had a bit of space to keep a few weight sets for lighter days. They had already scheduled time on Friday for a special video chat session to make sure he was settling into his new residence well, and Izuku's heart swelled at how wonderful and thoughtful his friends were. One of the first things Izuku set up was his laptop. He was looking at the starting dates for Adiron Junior High, the school he'd chosen, and realized he'd still had the entrance exams UA General Studies bookmarked. With a click he deleted the page from his bookmarks and saved the page for UA's Heroics course.